Thanks to Fro for this incredible suggestion. Now let's dive into one of the darkest chapters in American intelligence history. Picture this. A dimly lit apartment on Telegraph Hill in San Francisco sometime in the mid-50s. The year doesn't matter as much as the atmosphere. Jazz music drifts through the walls from a neighbouring unit. Miles Davis or maybe Charlie Parker, the kind of cool bebop that makes you feel like you're living in a movie. A man walks through the door, his heart racing with anticipation. He's nervous but excited. He met a woman at a bar downtown, a place with red leather booths and bartenders who don't ask questions. She was beautiful, charming, and after an hour of conversation that felt effortless, she suggested they go somewhere more private. Now he's here. The apartment is decorated strangely, almost theatrically. Velvet curtains in deep purple, odd paintings on the walls, abstract shapes that seem to shift when you look at them too long. A mirror that takes up most of one wall, its surface spotless, reflecting the dim amber glow of table lamps. The woman pours him a drink. Whiskey, neat, just how he likes it. They sit close on a plush couch that's seen better days. He doesn't notice the tiny holes drilled in the ceiling where microphones hide. He doesn't notice the almost imperceptible hum of recording equipment running in the room next door. He has no idea that behind that mirror on the wall, CIA operatives are watching his every move. He has no idea that his drink has been spiked with a dose of LSD, powerful enough to shatter his grip on reality for the next 8 to 12 hours. He has no idea that everything he says and does will be recorded, analysed, and filed away in a government laboratory where men in lab coats will review his breakdown like it's data from a chemistry experiment. This isn't fiction. This isn't a paranoid fantasy cooked up by conspiracy theorists in dimly lit basements. This is Operation Midnight Climax, and it actually happened on American soil, funded by American taxpayers, authorised by American officials who swore oaths to protect and defend the Constitution. The seeds of paranoia. The story begins in the smoking ruins of World War II, when the world split into two armed camps, and the word peace became something of a sick joke. The Cold War wasn't just about nuclear weapons capable of ending civilization in an afternoon. It wasn't just about spy satellites and proxy wars, and the constant threat of mushroom clouds blooming over major cities. It was about something far more insidious, far more terrifying. The human mind itself, and the possibility that it could be hijacked, reprogrammed, turned into a weapon. American intelligence officers became obsessed with reports filtering out of communist countries. The details were fragmentary, often contradictory, but the pattern was disturbing. Prisoners of war returning from Korea told strange, unsettling stories. They spoke of interrogation techniques that seemed to break men from the inside out, not through physical torture, though there was plenty of that, but through psychological methods that were harder to understand and impossible to resist. These men described confessions that felt real even though they knew they were false. They talked about being shown evidence of crimes they hadn't committed, and slowly, inexorably, coming to believe they'd actually done those things. Some soldiers came home and couldn't remember entire weeks or months of their captivity. Others remembered everything but claimed that for periods of time they hadn't felt like themselves, as though someone else had been controlling their actions while their consciousness watched helplessly from somewhere deep inside. Were these stories true? Were they exaggerated? Were they the result of trauma and the mind's attempt to make sense of incomprehensible suffering? The CIA didn't know. What they did know was that the possibility of enemy brainwashing capabilities represented an existential threat that couldn't be ignored. The logic, if you can call it that, went something like this. If the Soviets, Chinese and North Koreans had developed sophisticated methods of psychological conditioning, methods that could turn captured Americans into propaganda tools or even sleeper agents, then the United States needed to develop the same capabilities, not just to use offensively, but defensively. How could you protect your people against mind control if you didn't understand how it worked? How could you counter enemy techniques if you hadn't explored those techniques yourself? Whether this threat was real almost didn't matter. The belief alone was enough to spark a terrifying arms race, not of missiles and bombs, but of minds. If the enemy could turn American soldiers into puppets, if they could extract secrets through chemical manipulation, if they could program unwilling subjects to become assassins who would kill on command and then forget they'd ever received orders, then America needed those same tools in its arsenal. That was the justification anyway. That was the story told in classified briefing rooms where decisions were made that would ruin countless lives. In the early 1950s, CIA Director Allen Dulles, a man whose resume included helping wealthy Germans move their money during the Nazi era, and who seemed to view morality as something that applied to other people, authorised a sprawling research program that would eventually be known as MK Ultra. The name itself was characteristically cryptic, designed to reveal nothing about the program's true nature. The goal was simple in concept, but horrifying in execution. Investigate every possible method of controlling human behaviour through chemical, biological and psychological means. Leave no stone unturned. Let no ethical consideration stand in the way of knowledge. At the centre of this web, pulling strings and signing off on experiments that would make Nazi physicians nod in approval, sat a man named Sidney Gottlieb. He was a CIA chemist with a club foot that gave him a distinctive limp, a stutter that made him seem harmless, and an apparently unlimited capacity for moral compromise. Gottlieb had a doctorate in chemistry from Caltech, one of the most prestigious scientific institutions in the world. On weekends he ran a folk dancing club, twirling and stomping with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved life's simple pleasures. He raised goats on a farm, made his own cheese, and by all outward appearances seemed like an eccentric but harmless academic who'd found his way into government service. But Gottlieb had been given carte blanche to explore the darkest corners of human experimentation. His budget was hidden deep in the CIA's Black Operations Fund, a financial rabbit hole that existed beyond congressional oversight or public accountability. His work was classified at levels that kept even most agency personnel in the dark. Colleagues in other departments knew only that Gottlieb ran something important, and that asking questions about his work was a career-limiting move. And his weapon of choice, the compound that would fuel countless experiments and ruin innumerable lives, was something that had only recently been synthesized in a Swiss laboratory, lysergic acid diethylamide. LSD. The promise of LSD. In the early 50s, LSD was legal, newly discovered and utterly mysterious. It existed in that strange liminal space where science fiction meets reality, where the impossible suddenly becomes merely improbable. Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann had first synthesized it in the late 30s while researching ergot alkaloids, those strange compounds produced by fungi that grow on rye and other grains. Hofmann was looking for respiratory and circulatory stimulants. What he found instead would change the course of psychiatric research, fuel a counterculture revolution, and become a cornerstone of illegal government human experimentation. The discovery of LSD's psychoactive properties was accidental. Years after the initial synthesis, Hofmann was handling the compound in his laboratory when he absorbed some through his skin. What followed was unlike anything in his experience. Hofmann described a dreamlike state that was simultaneously terrifying and beautiful. Vivid hallucinations erupted behind his closed eyes. Reality took on a fluid, malleable quality. His normal sense of self, the stable core of consciousness that tells you who and what you are, underwent a complete dissolution. He felt he was losing his mind, that he might never return to normal awareness. He did return, of course, shaken but unharmed, and immediately recognised that he'd stumbled onto something profound. This wasn't just another pharmaceutical compound. This was something that could fundamentally alter human consciousness itself. The CIA saw potential that went far beyond psychiatric therapy or philosophical exploration. Here was a drug that could shatter perception, dissolve the ego's defences, and leave subjects vulnerable and suggestible in ways that no amount of physical torture could achieve. The questions that consumed Gottlieb and his team of researchers were tantalizing enough to overcome any moral hesitation. Could LSD force someone to tell the truth during interrogation? Could it function as a kind of chemical spotlight that illuminated the dark corners of the mind where secrets hide? Could it erase traumatic memories, allowing operatives to undergo terrible experiences and then have those experiences wiped clean like chalk from a blackboard? Could it plant false memories, creating confusion about what had really happened? Could it break down psychological resistance so completely that subjects would cooperate fully with their interrogators, believing they were doing so of their own free will? Could it turn an ordinary person into an unwitting operative who would carry out orders and then forget they'd ever received them, creating the perfect untraceable assassin? These weren't idle speculations. These were operational questions that demanded empirical answers, and to get those answers, they needed human test subjects, lots of them. People who could be dosed, observed, and studied under controlled conditions without their knowledge or consent. The problem was consent. Even in the early 50s, before the modern framework of research ethics had fully developed, there were rules about human experimentation. No legitimate review board would approve experiments this dangerous, this unethical, this far beyond the boundaries of acceptable science. The experiments proposed under MKUltra made the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study look almost benign by comparison. The solution from the CIA's perspective was elegantly simple. Don't ask for consent. Don't seek approval from review boards. Don't even tell the subjects they're being tested. Find ways to dose people without their knowledge, in environments where their reactions can be carefully observed and documented, and classify the whole operation at levels that ensure nobody outside a small circle of initiated insiders ever learns what's happening. This is where Operation Midnight Climax enters the story, stage left, trailing shadows and moral bankruptcy. The man behind the mirror. George Hunter White was not a scientist. He didn't have a doctorate or spend his days pondering the mysteries of human consciousness. He was a federal narcotics agent with a reputation for getting results by any means necessary, legal or otherwise. Short, stocky, and physically aggressive, White had the build and temperament of a bulldog. He'd spent years cultivating relationships with criminals, informants, drug dealers, pimps, and people who lived in the grey zones of society where law and order are more theoretical than actual. White had worked deep undercover in some of the most dangerous environments imaginable. He'd made dangerous busts that put violent people behind bars. He'd developed connections in organised crime that would prove invaluable for intelligence work. And through it all, he'd developed a certain contempt for bureaucratic niceties, for the rules and regulations that seemed designed to make effective law enforcement impossible. White believed in getting the job done. The details of how you got there were less important than the results. The CIA recruited him precisely because he had no qualms about getting his hands dirty. They needed someone who could operate in moral grey zones, someone who wouldn't lose sleep over the questionable legality or blatant immorality of what they were asking him to do. White fit the profile perfectly. In the spring of 1954, White was given an unusual assignment, even by the standards of Cold War intelligence work. He would create a series of safe houses, a term that usually means secure locations for protecting valuable assets or conducting sensitive meetings, where unwitting subjects could be secretly dosed with LSD and other drugs, while their behaviour was observed, filmed, and recorded in exhaustive detail. The twist, the detail that elevated this from unethical human experimentation to something uniquely perverse, was that these safe houses would be disguised as brothels. The operational logic was sound in a twisted way. Men visiting prostitutes were already engaged in illegal activity in most jurisdictions. They were unlikely to report strange experiences to police. They'd be embarrassed, vulnerable, and easily dismissed if they did come forward. The social stigma associated with visiting sex workers would keep them silent, and the presence of sex workers themselves provided a natural cover for the operation, while also allowing researchers to study how LSD affected sexual behaviour and inhibition. White set to work with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found his true calling. He rented apartments in San Francisco, choosing locations in areas where unusual activity wouldn't draw too much attention. Telegraph Hill was perfect, bohemian enough that strange comings and goings would blend into the neighbourhood's general eccentricity, but upscale enough that the men being lured there would feel comfortable. The apartments were furnished with decor that can only be described as garish. Think Bordello meets art student's first apartment. Velvet curtains in deep reds and purples, cheap but exotic-looking furniture, dim lighting that created atmosphere while also hiding the various surveillance equipment, paintings and decorations that seemed just slightly off, slightly wrong, like they'd been chosen by someone who'd heard about interior design but never actually seen a well-decorated room. The centrepiece of each safe house was a two-way mirror installed in the bedroom. From one side it looked like an ordinary mirror, perhaps unusually large, but nothing that would raise immediate suspicion. From the other side it was a window offering a perfect view of everything happening in the room. Behind these mirrors, CIA operatives would sit for hours, watching, filming, taking notes, documenting every detail of how the drugs affected their unwitting subjects. White hired sex workers to staff these operations. The women, and they were all women, working with male subjects, reflecting both the era's assumptions about sexuality and the operational focus of the research, were told they were working for the government, conducting important research that would help protect American national security. Most of them had criminal records related to prostitution. White offered them good money, regular work, and in some cases immunity for past legal troubles. For women used to operating on the margins of society, constantly at risk of arrest and prosecution, this must have seemed like an incredible opportunity. They were trained in how to lure men back to the apartments, how to make them feel comfortable, and most importantly, how to dose their drinks without arousing suspicion. The dosing had to be subtle. Too obvious, and the subject might refuse the drink or become suspicious. The women became expert at palming pills, at pouring drinks with practiced misdirection, at keeping conversation flowing, while they spiked cocktails with substances that would soon tear apart their client's grip on reality. The men who entered these apartments, walking through those doors with a mixture of excitement and nervousness, thought they were paying for sex. Instead, they became unwitting guinea pigs in a government mind control experiment that would have been considered science fiction if someone had proposed it in a novel. Behind the mirrors, CIA operatives watched and filmed everything. The observation rooms were cramped, dark, and smelled of stale cigarettes and instant coffee. Agents sat in uncomfortable chairs, eyes fixed on the scenes unfolding on the other side of the glass, notebooks open, cameras rolling. The men's drinks would be spiked with LSD, sometimes combined with alcohol to enhance the drug's effects, or barbiturates to study how different substances interacted, or marijuana to see if the combination made subjects more suggestible. Then the watchers waited to see what would happen. This was the heart of the experiment, observing human beings as they lost their grip on reality, documenting their responses, cataloguing their fears and revelations, treating consciousness itself as just another variable to be measured and manipulated. Would the men become more talkative, revealing secrets or confessing to things they'd normally keep hidden? Would they become paranoid, seeing threats everywhere, reacting to phantoms? Would their inhibitions dissolve completely, engaging in behaviour they'd normally suppress? Would they become violent, lashing out at perceived threats? Would they become suggestible, accepting instructions or ideas they'd normally reject? Would they become catatonic, collapsing into unresponsive states as their minds struggled to process the overwhelming sensory distortion? Every reaction was noted with clinical detachment. Every word was recorded on reel-to-reel tape machines, the magnetic ribbon capturing confessions, screams, rambling monologues, and terrified pleas. Hidden cameras, state-of-the-art for the era but primitive by modern standards, captured footage that would later be reviewed frame by frame by analysts at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, men who would watch other men's worst moments and take notes like they were observing laboratory rats. The whole operation had a veneer of scientific methodology. There were protocols, forms to fill out, data to be collected and analysed. But strip away that veneer and what remained was something much darker. State-sanctioned voyeurism mixed with psychological torture, human experimentation that crossed every ethical line, and a profound contempt for the rights and dignity of American citizens. Inside the safe house. Let's slow down and really examine what happened inside these apartments. The clinical description doesn't capture the horror of the experience for those who lived through it. We need to get closer, more visceral, to understand what Operation Midnight Climax actually meant for its victims. Imagine being one of those men. You've met an attractive woman at a bar in North Beach or the Tenderloin, one of those places where sailors and workers and businessmen mix together in the democratic anonymity of alcohol and dim lights. She's engaging, funny, seems genuinely interested in you. In an era where women were expected to be demure and passive, her forwardness is exciting. She laughs at your jokes, she touches your arm when she talks. After an hour of conversation that feels natural and easy, she leans close and suggests going back to her place. Your heart races. You're nervous. You've never done anything like this before, or maybe you have, but it still makes you anxious. But you agree. You pay your tab, leave the bar together, walk through San Francisco streets still busy despite the late hour. She takes you to an apartment building on Telegraph Hill, upstairs that creak, down a hallway where you can hear jazz music and muffled conversations from neighbouring units. The apartment door opens and you step into a world that seems slightly unreal. The decor is strange, too deliberately bohemian, like a stage set. There are velvet curtains, paintings of abstract shapes, furniture that's simultaneously plush and worn. A mirror dominates one wall, its surface reflecting the amber glow of table lamps. The whole space has an odd quality, like it exists slightly outside normal reality. You notice this peripherally, but don't dwell on it. You're focused on the woman, on the anticipation of what's about to happen. She offers you a drink. Whiskey, perhaps, or gin. You say yes. She moves to a small bar in the corner, her back to you, and you hear the clink of glass, the splash of liquid being poured. She returns with 2 glasses, hands you one, sits close on a couch that's seen better years of use. You talk, you drink. The whiskey burns pleasantly as it goes down. You don't notice anything unusual about the taste. Why would you? The dosage has been calculated carefully. Just enough LSD to have profound effects, but not so much that it overwhelms the flavour of whatever alcohol it's mixed with. The women working for White have become expert at this, knowing exactly how to mask the drug's presence. 30 minutes pass, maybe 45. You're feeling good, relaxed, the alcohol warming you from inside. And then, subtle at first, things begin to change. The edges of your vision seem to shimmer, colours become more vivid, more saturated, as though someone has adjusted the contrast on reality itself. The woman's face takes on an odd quality, simultaneously familiar and strange. The paintings on the wall seem to move when you're not looking directly at them, shapes shifting and flowing like they're alive. You shake your head, trying to clear it. Maybe you drank too fast. Maybe the whiskey was stronger than you thought. But the sensation intensifies. The walls seem to breathe, expanding and contracting in rhythm with your heartbeat. Patterns emerge from the textured wallpaper, complex geometric designs that couldn't possibly be there but are undeniably present. The ambient sounds, the jazz from next door, the distant street noise, your own breathing, take on a crystalline quality, each sound distinct and impossibly clear. Your sense of self begins to fragment. This is perhaps the most terrifying part, harder to describe than the visual distortions. That stable sense of being you, the continuous thread of consciousness that's been constant your entire life, starts to unravel. You're simultaneously yourself and watching yourself from outside, unable to reconcile these two perspectives. Time loses all meaning. Seconds stretch into eternities, or maybe hours have passed in what felt like moments. You can't tell, and the inability to tell is itself terrifying. The woman you came here with, the woman whose name you now can't remember, seems to transform. Sometimes she appears sinister, her face shifting into a mask of malevolence. Sometimes she seems angelic, glowing with an inner light that makes you want to weep at her beauty. Sometimes she doesn't seem quite human at all, more like an idea of a person, a symbol representing something you can't quite grasp. And through it all, though you don't know it, men in suits are watching from the other side of that mirror. They're taking notes on your breakdown, recording your reactions, treating your terror and confusion as data points to be analysed. You're not a person to them. You're subject 17 or case number 43, a biological system responding to chemical stimuli. The experience varies wildly from person to person. Some subjects had relatively benign trips, if such a thing exists when you're drugged without consent and under surveillance. They giggled through harmless hallucinations, marvelled at the strange beauty of altered perception, and eventually came down feeling shaken but not permanently damaged. Others weren't so lucky. Some experienced psychological breaks that lasted for days or weeks. They reported seeing demons, being pursued by malevolent entities, experiencing their own death over and over in an infinite loop of terror. Reality splintered into fragments they couldn't reassemble. The fear didn't end when the drug wore off. It lingered, colouring everything, making them question whether they could trust their own perceptions ever again. Some subjects became violent, lashing out at perceived threats that didn't exist. The women working these operations were sometimes injured, though this rarely made it into official reports. The CIA was more concerned with data collection than worker safety. Others became catatonic, collapsing into unresponsive states as their minds simply couldn't process the overwhelming sensory distortion. They'd sit motionless for hours, eyes wide and unseeing, while the watchers behind the mirror documented their condition with clinical detachment. The psychological aftermath was often severe. Men left these apartments confused, traumatised, unable to fully articulate what had happened to them. Many reported lasting paranoia, a persistent sense that they were being watched or followed. Relationships crumbled. Some men lost their jobs, their behaviour having become too erratic for employers to tolerate. A few ended up institutionalised, diagnosed with schizophrenia or other mental illnesses that may have been triggered or exacerbated by their unwitting participation in Operation Midnight Climax. None of them had consented to any of it. None of them understood what had been done to them, and for decades, nobody would believe their stories because the truth was too outrageous to be credible. The internal testing. Here's the truly chilling part, the detail that transforms this from unethical experimentation into something approaching collective insanity. The CIA didn't limit their testing to strangers picked up in bars and dosed in fake brothels. Internal documents later revealed that agency personnel also dosed each other without warning, slipping LSD into coffee during meetings, spiking punch bowls at office parties, even dosing colleagues just to see how they'd react under pressure. The reasoning, such as it was, went like this. Operatives needed first-hand experience with LSD so they could recognise its effects if an enemy ever used it against them. They needed to know what the drug felt like, how it altered perception and cognition, so they wouldn't be caught completely off guard if they were dosed in the field. This logic, already dubious, didn't account for the fact that being unexpectedly dosed in a familiar environment by people you trusted was arguably more traumatic than being dosed by an enemy. At least with an enemy, you knew where you stood. But having your own colleagues drug you without warning shattered the most basic foundations of workplace trust and safety. The culture within the MKUltra program became increasingly bizarre and reckless. Stories circulated about CIA officers showing up to work never quite sure if their morning coffee had been spiked, Some operatives apparently developed paranoia about office refreshments, bringing their own drinks in sealed containers, treating communal coffee pots with a suspicion usually reserved for foreign agents. One case stands out for its tragic consequences and the questions it raised about the program's true nature. Frank Olson was a CIA officer working in the agency's Biological Warfare Division. In November of 1953, Olson attended a retreat with other CIA personnel at a lodge in Western Maryland. The retreat was supposed to be a team-building exercise, a chance for officers to relax and strengthen their working relationships. On the second night, Sidney Gottlieb, who was attending the retreat, spiked the after-dinner drinks with LSD. Nobody was warned, nobody consented. The drug took effect while the men were relaxing, socialising, letting their guard down in what they thought was a safe environment. Most of the officers experienced the trip and recovered, though several later reported lingering psychological effects. But Olson had a severe adverse reaction. He became increasingly agitated, paranoid and depressed. The symptoms didn't resolve as the drug wore off. Instead, they intensified. Olson became convinced he'd made grave professional errors. He talked about quitting the agency. His colleagues and superiors grew concerned about his state of mind and what he might reveal in his deteriorated psychological state. A week after the retreat, Olson was in New York City, supposedly under the care of a CIA physician who specialised in managing LSD-related complications. In the early morning hours of November 28, 1953, Olson crashed through the closed window of his hotel room on the 13th floor and fell to his death on the sidewalk below. The official story called it suicide, a tragic consequence of underlying mental health issues exacerbated by LSD. But Olson's family never believed this explanation. They spent decades fighting for the truth, demanding investigations, challenging the CIA's narrative. Their persistence eventually forced the release of previously classified documents that raised disturbing questions about what really happened that night. Some of these documents suggested Olson had been expressing serious ethical concerns about the biological weapons research he was involved in. Others indicated that his erratic behaviour after being dosed had made him a security risk in the eyes of his superiors. There were hints that the CIA feared he might go public with what he knew about the agency's more questionable activities. The question that haunts researchers and Olson's surviving family members is whether his death was really a suicide or whether he was murdered, pushed from that hotel window by people who decided he'd become too much of a liability. We'll probably never know for certain. The witnesses are dead, the evidence is contradictory, and the agency has no incentive to reveal anything that would implicate its personnel in murder. What we do know is that Frank Olson's death marked a turning point. It forced some internal recognition that the MKUltra experiments were spiralling out of control, that the casual dosing of personnel had gone from questionable research to dangerous recklessness. But this recognition didn't lead to meaningful reform or accountability. It led to better operational security, more careful documentation, and increased efforts to ensure that if things went wrong, they could be covered up more effectively. The descent into depravity, the moral rot at the heart of Operation Midnight Climax extended beyond the central mission of dosing unwitting subjects. George Hunter White's personal diary, which surfaced years later during congressional investigations, provides a disturbing window into the mindset that prevailed among those running the operation. In one particularly chilling passage, White wrote, "Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, cheat, steal, deceive, rape, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest?" Read that again. This wasn't a moment of reflection or regret. This was celebration. White was expressing joy, almost glee, at having found a situation where normal moral constraints didn't apply. The All-Highest he referenced was the CIA, the intelligence apparatus that had given him license to operate outside the law and beyond ethical boundaries. The diary entries paint a picture of a man intoxicated, not just by the alcohol he consumed in vast quantities, but by power and moral license. White hosted parties at the safe houses where CIA officers, visiting dignitaries, and selected guests would drink heavily and watch the proceedings behind the mirror like it was entertainment. These weren't scientific observations conducted with professional detachment. They were viewed as a show, a spectacle, a form of voyeuristic entertainment that happened to generate data as a side effect. The line between intelligence work and personal indulgence blurred completely and then disappeared altogether. White decorated one of the safe houses with a photograph of himself, sitting in front of a table covered with various drugs and paraphernalia, grinning at the camera like a kid showing off his toys. The image captured something essential about the operation. This wasn't grim, but necessary work done reluctantly in service of national security. This was something its participants enjoyed, something they found thrilling and liberating. Taxpayer money funded not just the drugs and surveillance equipment, but also the lavish lifestyle White cultivated around these operations. The CIA covered the rent on multiple apartments, paid the sex workers generous wages, provided unlimited alcohol, and financed White's personal entertainment. The official designation was behavioural research, a term that made it sound scientific and serious. The reality was much uglier. A government-funded party where drugging and manipulating American citizens was treated as sport. The drugs used weren't limited to LSD, though that remained the primary focus. White's team experimented with a disturbing array of substances, often combining them in ways that pushed subjects to psychological breaking points. Amobarbital, a barbiturate sedative, was used to create states of reduced inhibition and increased talkativeness, the so-called truth serum effect that interrogators had long sought. Subjects under the influence of amobarbital would become drowsy, compliant and talkative, sometimes revealing information they'd normally keep hidden. Marijuana was tested in various combinations, with researchers interested in whether it enhanced suggestibility or reduced anxiety in ways that could be exploited during interrogation. Sodium pentothal, another barbiturate with supposed truth serum properties, was administered to subjects to see if it could be used to extract reliable information. But the most disturbing experiments involved combining multiple substances. LSD mixed with alcohol created unpredictable effects, sometimes inducing terrifying hallucinations, sometimes creating a manic euphoria that dissolved all inhibitions. LSD combined with barbiturates could produce a strange state, where subjects were simultaneously hallucinating and sedated, trapped in vivid nightmares they couldn't wake from. Some cocktails were designed to maximize fear responses, pushing subjects into states of terror that lasted hours. There was no medical oversight, at least not in any meaningful sense. The CIA had physicians on staff who were technically supervising the experiments, but these were doctors who'd already compromised their Hippocratic oaths by participating in unethical human experimentation. They weren't there to protect the subjects' well-being. They were there to ensure subjects didn't die in ways that would create complications for the agency. No one was checking on the well-being of the subjects after they left the safe houses. No one monitored them for long-term psychological or physiological effects. No protocol existed for what to do if someone had a medical emergency or complete psychological breakdown that lasted beyond the expected duration of the drug's effects. The attitude seemed to be that these were expendable people, criminals and deviants who'd wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time, men whose suffering was acceptable collateral damage in the name of national security. This raises an uncomfortable question about the nature of evil. We like to think of evil as dramatic, as something done by obvious villains with clear malicious intent. But Operation Midnight Climax demonstrates how evil can be banal, bureaucratic, hidden behind clipboards and requisition forms and budget line items. The people running these operations weren't cackling supervillains. They were government employees with families and hobbies, people who went home at night and had dinner and probably considered themselves patriots serving their country. They'd simply found a way to compartmentalise the harm they were causing, to separate the human consequences of their actions from the abstract goals they were pursuing. The network expands. By the late 1950s, the operation had expanded well beyond the initial San Francisco safe house. White established another operation in New York City, tucked away in Greenwich Village, that bohemian enclave where artists and writers and people living on the margins could exist without drawing excessive attention. The New York safe house followed the same basic playbook: hire sex workers, rent a discreet apartment, install surveillance equipment, and start dosing unwitting subjects. But the New York operation had its own distinctive character. Greenwich Village in the 50s was a creative ferment, a neighbourhood where beat poets read in coffee shops and jazz musicians played in basement clubs, and people talked about art and politics until dawn. The safe house blended into this environment perfectly, just another odd apartment in a neighbourhood full of odd apartments. The New York operation also drew a somewhat different clientele than San Francisco. While the West Coast safe houses primarily caught sailors, workers, and small-time businessmen, the New York location saw artists, writers, musicians, and occasionally people with more significant public profiles. There's speculation, impossible to verify because the records were destroyed, that some relatively prominent cultural figures were dosed in the Greenwich Village safe house. If true, the potential for blackmail would have been enormous. Additional sites may have operated in other cities, though documentation is sparse and contradictory. Some researchers believe safe houses existed in Washington, D.C., allowing the CIA to potentially target politicians and government officials. Others point to suggestive evidence of operations in Los Angeles and Chicago. The truth is, we'll never know the full extent of the program, because the systematic destruction of records in the 70s ensured that many secrets stayed buried. What we know for certain is that by the late 50s, multiple safe houses were active simultaneously, processing dozens, if not hundreds, of subjects each year. The scale of the operation was staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that over the course of its existence, Operation Midnight Climax dosed several thousand men without their knowledge or consent. The actual number could be significantly higher. Inside CIA headquarters at Langley, this was still framed as cutting-edge behavioural science. Gottlieb and his team received regular reports from the safe houses, delivered in unmarked folders through secure channels. They analysed the recordings, looking for patterns and insights that could be weaponized. Which drug combinations produced the most suggestibility? Under what conditions did subjects reveal secrets? Could terror be induced reliably and controlled precisely? Could the effects of LSD be channeled in useful directions, or was the experience too chaotic to be operationally valuable? The research generated reams of data, most of which was ultimately judged to be of limited practical value. LSD, the agency reluctantly concluded, was not a reliable truth serum. People under its influence were highly suggestible, but they were also likely to confabulate, mixing reality with fantasy in ways that made their statements unreliable. The drug could break down psychological resistance, but it did so by shattering the mind's normal functioning so thoroughly that extracting useful information became nearly impossible. This didn't stop the experiments. Even as evidence mounted that LSD wasn't the miracle interrogation tool they'd hoped for, the program continued. This persistence suggests that for many involved, the research itself had become the point. The operation had taken on a life of its own, justified by momentum and institutional inertia as much as by any actual intelligence value. But something else was happening too. Something that would only become clear later when investigators started piecing together the full story. The agents and officers involved in Operation Midnight Climax began treating the safe houses as private clubs, places where they could indulge appetites and behaviours that normal society constrained. George Hunter White kept detailed logs of who visited the safe houses and when. These logs, partially recovered during later investigations, show that many visits had no clear research purpose. CIA officers would show up not to conduct experiments but to drink, socialise and indulge in the voyeuristic thrill of watching people lose their grip on reality. Some brought guests showing off the operation like it was a particularly exotic tourist attraction. The safe houses became a kind of shadow perk for CIA personnel, a place where the normal rules didn't apply, where you could watch human beings at their most vulnerable and tell yourself it was for the greater good. White would invite colleagues to come watch the show, and they'd spend evenings drinking and observing like Romans at the Colosseum, treating other people's suffering as entertainment. Reports suggest that the safe houses were also used for activities that had nothing to do with official CIA business. Some personnel allegedly used them for assignations, taking advantage of the apartments and the available sex workers for personal gratification. The line between official operations and personal pleasure dissolved entirely. The program had metastasized from dubious research into something that resembled organized abuse with government funding. And nobody was stopping it because everyone involved had reasons to stay quiet, whether from fear of ending a career-making operation or fear of being implicated in activities that, if exposed, would destroy careers and possibly result in criminal charges. The beginning of the end. By the early 60s, the cracks were becoming impossible to ignore. The CIA was still riding high from its Cold War successes, still operating with the confidence of an organisation that believed itself above accountability. But even within this culture of moral flexibility, Operation Midnight Climax was starting to look indefensible. Internal CIA memos from this period, later obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, show growing concern among mid-level administrators. These weren't bleeding-heart liberals troubled by abstract ethical considerations. These were practical intelligence officers worried about operational security and legal liability. The questions they raised had nothing to do with the morality of dosing citizens without consent and everything to do with the practical problems this created. What happens if a subject dies during an experiment? What's the agency's legal exposure? What if someone with a pre-existing medical condition has a catastrophic reaction to LSD? What if a subject figures out what happened and goes to the press? What if foreign intelligence services learn about the safe houses and use that information for propaganda purposes? The memo writers were concerned about consequences, not ethics. But even this limited form of accountability was enough to start the process of shutting down the operation. The CIA's Inspector General's office conducted a review in the early 60s and found what amounted to a rogue operation with minimal scientific value and enormous legal liability. The Inspector General's report, portions of which survived the later purge of documents, made for damning reading. It concluded that the dosing of unwitting subjects violated every principle of medical ethics that had been established in the wake of the Nuremberg trials. The use of sex workers and the creation of fake brothels crossed lines that even Cold War spy masters, men not known for their squeamishness, found uncomfortable when documented in official reports. The research, the report noted dryly, had produced little actionable intelligence. Experiments had confirmed that LSD was a powerful hallucinogen that could temporarily incapacitate people and make them highly suggestible. But these effects were too unpredictable and difficult to control to be useful in operational settings. You couldn't dose an enemy agent and reliably extract specific information. You couldn't program someone to carry out specific tasks and then forget about them. The drug was simply too chaotic, its effects too dependent on individual psychology and environmental factors. In other words, they'd been drugging American citizens for almost a decade, ruining lives and traumatizing hundreds, if not thousands of people, for research that had limited practical value. Even from a coldly utilitarian perspective, divorced from any moral consideration, the operation was a failure. In 1963, orders came down to shut it all down. The safe houses were to be quietly closed. Equipment was to be removed and either destroyed or transferred to other facilities. The sex workers were to be paid off and told, with whatever mixture of bribery and intimidation was necessary, to forget everything they'd seen. The whole operation was to be wrapped up and buried in classified archives where it would, ideally, never see daylight. White retired from government service shortly thereafter. He'd had a long career in law enforcement and intelligence, had worked operations that would have destroyed lesser men, and now he was done. He moved to California, settling in Stinson Beach, where he lived quietly for the remainder of his life. He never faced charges for his role in Operation Midnight Climax. Neither did anyone else involved in the operation. There were no courts-martial, no criminal prosecutions, no professional sanctions. The attitude within the CIA seemed to be that White and his team had simply been following orders, conducting research that higher-ups had authorized and funded. For more than a decade, Operation Midnight Climax remained hidden, buried in classified files that were locked in secure vaults, known only to a small circle of CIA insiders who had every reason to keep quiet. The victims had no idea what had been done to them. The public had no inkling that their government was capable of such activities. And the people responsible slept soundly, convinced they'd done difficult but necessary work in defence of national security. The truth emerges. The truth began to emerge in the mid-70s, during a period of unprecedented scrutiny of American intelligence agencies. The Vietnam War had shattered public trust in government. Watergate had exposed criminal behaviour at the highest levels of power, proving that conspiracy theories weren't always paranoid fantasies. Americans were asking hard questions about what their government had been doing in the shadows, and they weren't accepting national security as an automatic conversation ender anymore. The Church Committee, led by Senator Frank Church of Idaho, launched a sweeping investigation into domestic intelligence activities in 1975. The committee had broad subpoena power and a mandate to expose government abuses. Around the same time, Vice President Nelson Rockefeller chaired a commission examining similar issues, though with somewhat less aggressive investigative zeal. What these investigations found was staggering, almost beyond belief. The CIA hadn't just been spying on American citizens, though they'd done plenty of that. They'd been conducting psychological warfare experiments on the domestic population. They'd been dosing people with powerful drugs. They'd been working with organised crime. They'd been running brothels on American soil. The scope of the abuses was so vast that it was almost incomprehensible. MKUltra, the investigations discovered, wasn't just one program but an umbrella for dozens of sub-projects, many of them involving unethical and sometimes horrifying human experimentation. Universities had been used as testing grounds, with professors dosing students without their knowledge. Prisons had been turned into laboratories, with inmates offered reduced sentences in exchange for participating in experiments that often caused lasting harm. Mental institutions had been co-opted, with patients subjected to treatments that had more to do with breaking minds than healing them. Operation Midnight Climax was among the most egregious sub-projects, but it was far from alone. The breadth of MKUltra suggested a systemic problem, a complete breakdown of ethical constraints and oversight mechanisms that had allowed intelligence personnel to pursue virtually any avenue of research without accountability. In 1977, following the Church Committee revelations, the CIA declassified thousands of pages of MKUltra documents. Journalists and researchers pored over the files, and gradually the full scope of Operation Midnight Climax came into focus. The sanitized language of official reports couldn't quite hide the horror of what had been done. Survivors began coming forward, encouraged by the investigations and by the realization that they weren't alone, that others had experienced similar inexplicable trauma. Some described being drugged and disoriented, waking up hours later in unfamiliar surroundings with no clear memory of what had happened, only fragmentary impressions of terror and confusion. Others spoke of lasting psychological damage, of paranoia that never fully went away, of relationships destroyed by behavioural changes they couldn't explain or control, of careers derailed by psychological instability they couldn't trace to any source. One man, testifying before investigators, described an experience in a San Francisco safe house that had haunted him for over 2 decades. He'd gone back to an apartment with a woman he'd met at a bar, had a drink, and then reality had come apart. He remembered walls that breathed, faces that melted, hours of terror where he was convinced he was dying or going insane. When he finally came down and left the apartment, confused and shaken, he tried to put the experience behind him, but it wouldn't stay behind him. For years afterward, he suffered from nightmares, panic, attacks, and a persistent sense that reality wasn't quite stable, that it might shatter again at any moment. His marriage fell apart, he lost his job, he spent time in psychiatric facilities, and for most of that time, he had no idea what had actually happened to him. No framework for understanding why a single night had demolished his life so completely. Another survivor talked about how a single night of unknowingly consuming LSD had triggered latent mental illness that plagued him for decades. He'd had no history of psychological problems before that night. Afterward, he struggled with symptoms that doctors diagnosed as schizophrenia, auditory hallucinations, paranoid ideation, difficulty distinguishing reality from delusion. He'd spent years on antipsychotic medication, in and out of hospitals, his life effectively destroyed. When he learned about Operation Midnight Climax, pieces started to fall into place. The symptoms had started immediately after that confusing, terrifying night in an apartment he could barely remember. He'd been dosed, his brain chemistry altered in ways that triggered a cascade of psychological problems. But there was a massive problem with the survivors coming forward, and the investigations trying to piece together what happened. Most of the records had been deliberately destroyed. In 1973, as the Watergate scandal consumed Washington, and it became increasingly clear that intelligence agencies would soon face unprecedented public scrutiny, outgoing CIA Director Richard Helms made a fateful decision. He ordered the destruction of all MKUltra files, everything. The research data, the experimental protocols, the surveillance footage, the audio recordings, the administrative records, all of it was to be eliminated. The destruction was systematic and thorough. Boxes of documents were shredded into confetti. Reels of magnetic tape were erased. The recordings of men's worst moments electronically obliterated. Film canisters were opened and their contents burned. Thousands of hours of footage turned to ash and smoke. The goal was to make it as though MKUltra had never existed, to eliminate any evidence that could be used to hold individuals accountable, or prove the full extent of the program's abuses. The destruction was so comprehensive that investigators in the 70s could only piece together fragments of what had really happened. The true number of victims, the full extent of the experiments, the complete list of safe-house locations, the names of everyone involved, all of it vanished into industrial shredders and incinerators. The history of Operation Midnight Climax exists now only in outline, with the details lost forever. What survived was largely accidental. Some documents had been mislabeled and filed in the wrong places, allowing them to escape the purge. Financial records, which were kept separately and overlooked during the destruction order, provided a paper trail showing how much money had been spent and where it had gone. And most importantly, the testimony of people who'd been there, who'd participated or been victimised, provided first-hand accounts that no amount of document shredding could eliminate. These fragments were enough to confirm that Operation Midnight Climax had happened, that the core accusations were true, that the government really had drugged citizens in fake brothels and called it research. But the gaps in the record remain frustrating and troubling. We know what happened in broad strokes, but the specific details, who exactly was victimised, what precisely was done to them, who gave which orders and when, are lost. The conspiracy deepens. As researchers dug deeper into the fragmentary evidence, examining what had survived the purge and interviewing everyone they could find who had knowledge of the program, a disturbing pattern emerged. Operation Midnight Climax may not have been primarily about LSD research at all. The drug testing might have been cover for something else entirely. Blackmail. Think about the operational reality. The CIA was secretly filming prominent men in compromising sexual situations, while those men were under the influence of mind-altering drugs. every session created potential blackmail material. Get someone on film in a San Francisco safe house, engaging in activities they'd never want made public, saying things they'd never want attributed to them, and you own them. You have leverage that can be used to secure cooperation, extract favours, or simply ensure silence. The blackmail theory isn't just speculation. There's circumstantial evidence supporting it. Pieces of a puzzle that, while individually inconclusive, collectively paint a suggestive picture. First, consider George Hunter White's background and connections. He wasn't just a federal narcotics agent. He had extensive ties to organised crime, relationships built over years of undercover work and complicated by the realities of Prohibition-era law enforcement. The mob controlled prostitution in most major American cities. They had their own networks of safe houses and compromising situations used for leverage. White would have been intimately familiar with these tactics. The CIA had a long, documented history of working with organised crime when it suited their purposes. They'd partnered with the mob in attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro. They'd used criminal networks to move money and weapons. The overlap between CIA operations and criminal enterprises was far more extensive than most people realise. The safe houses in Operation Midnight Climax closely resembled mob-run honey trap operations. The techniques, using sex workers to lure marks, compromising them in situations they couldn't escape without embarrassment, creating leverage through documentation of illegal or socially unacceptable behaviour, was straight from the organised crime playbook. Second, consider the targets. While many of the men caught in these operations were ordinary citizens, sailors on shore leave, businessmen looking for excitement, workers unwinding after long shifts, there are suggestions that some subjects were chosen more deliberately. The Greenwich Village safe house in particular is rumoured to have attracted or targeted people with public profiles: artists, writers, academics, people whose work or social positions made them potentially useful sources of information or influence. Documentary evidence is sparse because of the record destruction, but there are tantalising hints. Expense reports that survived show payments for special operations, distinct from the regular brothel maintenance costs. Memos reference priority subjects, without explaining what made them priorities. There are gaps in the recovered financial records during periods when, according to witnesses, the safe houses were particularly active. Third, consider what happened to the recordings. The CIA claims all the footage and audio tapes were destroyed in the 1973 purge, but people who've spent careers studying intelligence agencies are sceptical of this claim. The historical pattern is that truly sensitive material, information that could be used as leverage or might need to be accessed later, doesn't get destroyed. It gets hidden, secured, kept available for potential future use. There are whispers, impossible to verify, that the tapes didn't all end up in incinerators. Some allegedly found their way into private hands, parcelled out to powerful people as insurance, or traded for favours. The logic is grimly practical. If you're holding blackmail material on someone influential, you don't destroy that leverage. You keep it, use it when necessary, and pass it on to ensure it remains useful. There are theories that copies exist in foreign intelligence archives, obtained through spies or defectors who recognise their value. The KGB would have loved to get its hands on footage of American officials in compromising positions. So would other intelligence services. If any of the people involved in Operation Midnight Climax were recruited by foreign powers, this safe house recordings would have been invaluable. Fourth, consider the timing and manner of the operation's closure. The programme was shut down in 1963, officially because the Inspector General found it unethical and unproductive. But some researchers note that this was also the year of several significant intelligence scandals and growing congressional scrutiny of CIA activities. Shutting down the safe houses might have been less about ethics and more about removing a potential embarrassment before it could be discovered. The closure was quiet, almost furtive. No announcement, no acknowledgement that anything had been happening. The apartments were simply vacated, the sex workers paid off and warned to stay quiet, the equipment removed. But witnesses, maintenance workers, landlords, neighbours reported something odd. Months and even years after the official closure, mysterious men continued to rent or visit these properties, always using false names, always paying in cash, always somehow connected to private defence contractors or consulting firms with opaque ownership structures. If the CIA really shut down the safe houses completely, who was using them, and for what purpose? The agency has never provided a satisfactory answer. One possibility is that the official shutdown was a bureaucratic fiction, that the operations continued but with even deeper classification and more careful operational security. Another possibility is that the safe houses were transferred to different organisations, private contractors perhaps, or other intelligence agencies that could continue similar activities with less direct CIA involvement and therefore less institutional risk. The safe houses could have served a dual purpose from the beginning: genuine if unethical drug research on some subjects and targeted blackmail operations against others. The drug testing provided cover, a seemingly scientific rationale for activities that might otherwise have been impossible to justify, even within the classified world of intelligence operations. And here's where it gets truly unsettling, where the conspiracy theories start to sound uncomfortably plausible. The techniques pioneered in Operation Midnight Climax closely resemble what intelligence agencies call honey traps, operations where sex, romance, or the appearance thereof is used to compromise and control targets. Throughout the Cold War, both sides used these tactics extensively. The Soviets were famous for it, using attractive agents to seduce Western diplomats and officials, then using photographs or recordings of the encounters to force cooperation. The Americans did the same thing, though perhaps with slightly more euphemistic language in official reports. The safe houses were perfect honey trap facilities. They were designed specifically to create compromising situations that could be documented. The presence of drugs added another layer of leverage. Not only could you threaten to reveal someone's sexual indiscretions, but you could also threaten to expose their drug use, which in the 1950s and 60s carried severe legal penalties and social stigma. Moreover, people dosed with LSD without their knowledge were often uncertain about what had really happened during their experience. The drug's effects included memory problems, confusion about the timeline of events, difficulty distinguishing hallucination from reality. This confusion made victims vulnerable to suggestion. An operative could tell someone, "You said this," or "You did that," and the person, unable to fully trust their own recollections, might accept the claim even if it was false. This created opportunities for manipulation that went beyond simple blackmail into more sophisticated forms of psychological control. The ultimate nightmare scenario, and one that several researchers have explored, is that some of the safe house recordings were used to blackmail people into positions where they could be further exploited. Imagine a politician or businessman caught on film in a San Francisco apartment under the influence of LSD, engaged in behaviour that would destroy his career if revealed. He's approached afterward by people who have the footage. They don't want money. They want cooperation, access, information. Maybe they want him to vote a certain way on particular legislation. Maybe they want inside information about business deals. Maybe they just want him to remain silent about something he's learned. He cooperates, of course. What choice does he have? And once he's cooperated once, they have even more leverage. Now, he's not just someone who did something embarrassing. He's someone who betrayed his principles, who sold out, who collaborated with intelligence agents. The leverage compounds, the trap tightens, and escape becomes increasingly impossible. This isn't wild speculation. This is how intelligence agencies operate. The techniques are documented. The only question is whether Operation Midnight Climax was actually used this way, and if so, on what scale and against which targets. Without the destroyed records, we'll never know for certain. But the operational logic is sound, and the capabilities were clearly in place. The architects escape justice. In any sane world, when Operation Midnight Climax became public, those responsible would have faced severe consequences. At minimum, they should have been fired, disgraced, stripped of security clearances and government pensions. In a truly just world, they would have faced criminal prosecution for crimes including conspiracy, assault, drug trafficking, and multiple civil rights violations. But we don't live in that world. We live in a world where power protects itself, where the people who make policy are rarely held accountable for its consequences, where national security functions as a magic phrase that makes accountability disappear. George Hunter White died in October of 1975, just months before the Church Committee revelations would have made his name synonymous with government abuse. He was 71 years old, had lived a full life, died in his sleep in his Stinson Beach home with the Pacific Ocean, providing a soothing soundtrack. He never faced a courtroom, never had to answer hostile questions from investigators or journalists, never had to confront the men whose lives he'd helped destroy. His obituaries mentioned his long career in law enforcement and intelligence, but made no reference to Operation Midnight Climax because the operation was still classified. His diary surfaced later during the investigations, providing a window into his mindset. But the man himself escaped judgment. He's buried in a veteran cemetery, honoured for his service to his country, the darker aspects of that service buried with him. Sidney Gottlieb, the chemist who oversaw the entire MKUltra program, and who signed off on Operation Midnight Climax and dozens of other unethical experiments, also escaped meaningful consequences. He retired quietly from the CIA in the early 70s, shortly before the revelations that would have made his continued employment impossible. Gottlieb bought a farm in rural Virginia, raised goats, made artisanal cheese, and apparently slept soundly at night despite having directed human experiments that would have fit comfortably in a Nuremberg trial. His neighbours knew him as an eccentric but kindly man who loved folk dancing and had strong environmentalist convictions. They had no idea he'd once run a program that dosed thousands of Americans with powerful drugs without their consent. When journalists finally tracked him down in the 90s, he refused to discuss his CIA work in any detail. He expressed vague regrets about unfortunate excesses, but maintained that the research had been necessary given the threats America faced during the Cold War. He died in March of 1999, age 80, having lived a long life free from prosecution or public censure, beyond some critical articles that most people never read. The sex workers who'd worked in the safe houses, luring men and dosing their drinks on CIA orders, faced more complicated consequences. Most disappeared back into the underground economy, trying to leave this strange chapter of their lives behind them. A few gave interviews years later, when the story became public and journalists sought first-hand accounts. Their testimony was illuminating but often ambivalent. They'd been paid well, treated professionally in some ways, and many of them had genuinely believed they were contributing to important national security work. They'd been told they were helping to protect America from communist brainwashing techniques. They'd been led to believe the men being dosed were all volunteering for experiments, that everyone involved understood what was happening. When they learned the truth, that the men had been unwitting victims, that no consent had been obtained, that the operation was fundamentally unethical from top to bottom, their reactions varied. Some expressed remorse. Others remained defensive, arguing they'd just been following orders and trying to survive in a world that gave women in their profession few choices and little protection. Still others seemed to have compartmentalized the experience so thoroughly that they struggled to engage with questions about its morality. None of them faced legal consequences for their participation. The CIA had given them immunity, and even years later, when the operation became public, prosecutors showed no interest in going after the women who'd been essentially tools of the program rather than its architects. The subjects, the actual victims, received nothing. No compensation, no official apology beyond generic statements that mistakes were made. No acknowledgement beyond the bare admission that yes, this program existed, and yes, it was wrong. Several victims attempted to sue the government for damages. These cases were almost uniformly unsuccessful. The government argued sovereign immunity, claimed that state secrets privilege prevented full disclosure of what had happened, and used procedural manoeuvres to avoid meaningful accountability. Some cases were settled out of court for small sums with strict non-disclosure agreements attached. The government preferred to pay modest settlements rather than allow victims to pursue cases that might result in broader discovery of still classified information or set precedents for future claims. The message was clear. You might have been drugged and traumatized by your own government, but you have no recourse. Power protects itself. The government's position was essentially, mistakes were made, procedures have been improved, oversight is better now, let's move on. But you can't move on from something like this without reckoning with what it means, without holding people accountable, without creating systems that actually prevent similar abuses rather than just investigating them decades after the fact. The knowledge lives on. Here's perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Operation Midnight Climax. The detail that transforms it from historical atrocity into ongoing concern. The research didn't disappear just because the program was shut down and the files were shredded. The CIA learned things about human psychology during Operation Midnight Climax and the broader MKUltra program. They learned how drugs affect behaviour under different conditions. They learned techniques for breaking down psychological resistance. They learned methods for manipulating perception and creating vulnerability. That knowledge didn't evaporate when the safe houses closed. It got incorporated into training manuals, interrogation protocols, and behavioural analysis techniques. The specific tactics may have changed. The technology certainly has advanced, but the underlying philosophy remains: study human vulnerability, catalogue the ways consciousness can be altered and manipulated, then weaponise that knowledge for intelligence purposes. When you read about enhanced interrogation methods used decades later at facilities like Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay, when you learn about psychological operations designed to disorient and control, when you encounter descriptions of isolation, sensory deprivation, sleep disruption, and other techniques meant to break subjects without leaving physical marks, you're seeing the legacy of programs like MKUltra and Operation Midnight Climax. The through line from a CIA safe house in 1950s San Francisco to modern behavioural manipulation is more direct than most people realise. The knowledge was preserved, the techniques were refined, the applications multiplied. Some of the findings from LSD research made their way into academic psychology, minus the context of how they were obtained. Papers were published about how hallucinogens affect cognition and perception, studies that drew on data from MKUltra experiments without acknowledging that the data came from non-consenting subjects dosed in government brothels. This knowledge then influenced subsequent research, creating a genealogy of scientific understanding built partly on a foundation of unethical experimentation. Other findings influenced advertising and marketing psychology. The understanding of how to bypass rational thought, how to trigger emotional responses, how to manipulate behaviour without subjects fully realising they're being manipulated. These insights have applications beyond intelligence work. Advertisers, political consultants, and social media companies use techniques that owe intellectual debts to Cold War mind control research, though the connections are rarely acknowledged explicitly. The CIA also maintained relationships with researchers who'd been involved in MKUltra. Even after the program officially ended, Gottlieb and others continued to consult on projects related to behavioural control and psychological manipulation. Their expertise remained valuable, their knowledge sought after, their moral compromises forgiven in service of ongoing intelligence needs. This persistence of knowledge and relationships means that Operation Midnight Climax never really ended. It transformed, evolved, adapted to new technologies and changing social contexts. The specific tactic of dosing people in fake brothels may have been abandoned, but the broader project of studying and manipulating human consciousness for intelligence purposes continues. Echoes in the present. When you look at Operation Midnight Climax in historical context, certain patterns become disturbingly clear. The justification was always national security. The threat was portrayed as existential, and the enemy as ruthless, therefore our methods had to match theirs. Oversight was minimal because the threat was too urgent, too dangerous to allow bureaucratic interference or democratic accountability. These are the same arguments that reappear throughout history whenever governments seek to expand their power and dodge accountability. They're not unique to the Cold War or to the United States. They're universal rhetorical moves that authoritarian-leaning officials use in every time and place. The threat is real. The enemy is implacable. We need extraordinary powers to protect you. Trust us. Don't ask too many questions. National security prevents us from explaining in detail, but believe us when we say this is necessary. From Cold War LSD experiments to Vietnam-era surveillance of domestic activists, from post-9/11 warrantless wiretapping to contemporary mass data collection, the tools change, but the logic remains constant. Trust us. It's for your own good. We can't tell you the details, because that would compromise effectiveness, but we promise we're keeping you safe. Operation Midnight Climax proved that conspiracy theories aren't always theories. Sometimes the paranoid fantasy turns out to be documented fact. Your government really did drug citizens without consent. They really did film people in compromising situations for potential blackmail. They really did cover it up for decades. They really did destroy evidence to avoid accountability. And when it finally came to light, nobody was punished. This revelation reshaped public trust in lasting ways. Before the Church Committee investigations, suggestions that the CIA was conducting mind control experiments on Americans sounded like the ravings of paranoid cranks. After the investigations, after the documents were declassified and the testimony heard, those suggestions were proven correct. The cranks had been right. The paranoia had been justified. This doesn't mean every conspiracy theory is true. Most aren't. But Operation Midnight Climax demonstrated that dismissing uncomfortable accusations just because they sound outrageous is a mistake. Sometimes the truth is outrageous. Sometimes the people in power really are doing things that would be unbelievable if they weren't documented. The real horror isn't the drugging, yes. Dosing people with powerful hallucinogens without their knowledge or consent is horrifying. Yes, the violation of privacy and bodily autonomy is unconscionable. Yes, the lasting trauma inflicted on victims is a moral atrocity. But the deepest horror of Operation Midnight Climax isn't the specific acts. It's what those acts reveal about power, about institutions, about human nature itself. The men who ran this program weren't cartoon villains. They weren't sadists who enjoyed causing pain for its own sake, though some, like White, apparently did take a certain pleasure in their work. They were government employees, professionals with mortgages and families, people who presumably thought of themselves as patriots serving their country in dangerous times, and they convinced themselves that drugging strangers and filming them in brothels was not only acceptable but necessary. They constructed elaborate justifications, told themselves stories about defending freedom and protecting American security, and managed to sleep at night despite the harm they were causing. That's the real horror. How easily ordinary people can justify extraordinary evil when it's wrapped in the flag and stamped with a classification level. How moral boundaries that seem absolute can dissolve under pressure from authority and peer consensus. How people can compartmentalize, separating the harm they cause from the righteous narrative they tell themselves. White didn't see himself as a monster. In his mind, he was a warrior doing difficult work that soft civilians couldn't understand. He was on the front lines of an existential struggle, where conventional morality was a luxury America couldn't afford. His diary entries suggest not guilt but pride, not remorse but satisfaction, at having found a role where he could operate without constraints. Gottlieb thought he was advancing science and protecting national security. He apparently saw no contradiction between his peaceful persona, the goat farmer, the folk dancer, the environmentalist, and his professional role directing human experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics. These two aspects of his life existed in separate mental compartments, neither contaminating the other. The agents watching through two-way mirrors told themselves they were gathering intelligence that could save American lives. The sex workers convinced themselves they were serving their country. The CIA officials who authorized and funded the program believed they were doing what national security required in a dangerous world. None of them seemed to have lost much sleep over the men whose lives they damaged or destroyed, over the families torn apart, over the psychological trauma that rippled forward through the decades. The victims were abstractions, statistics, acceptable casualties in a larger struggle. This capacity for moral compartmentalization, for separating the harm you cause from the righteous narrative you tell yourself, is perhaps the most persistent danger in human affairs. It's how atrocities happen. It's how democracies slide into authoritarianism. It's how good people end up doing terrible things while maintaining their self-image as heroes rather than villains. Operation Midnight Climax is a case study in this process. It shows how institutional culture can normalise the abnormal, how secrecy can insulate people from accountability, how the language of national security can be used to justify almost anything. These aren't problems unique to the CIA or the 1950s. They're structural issues that persist wherever power operates without transparency and accountability. Understanding this is crucial because it means that preventing future atrocities requires more than just punishing individuals who participate in current ones. It requires changing the institutional conditions that make such participation possible and even rewarded. It requires building systems where doing the right thing is easier than doing the wrong thing, where transparency is default rather than exception, where accountability is real rather than theatrical. Lessons unlearned. You'd like to think that exposing something like Operation Midnight Climax would prevent similar abuses in the future. You'd like to believe that sunlight is the best disinfectant, that transparency breeds accountability, that we learn from our mistakes and build systems to prevent their recurrence. But the historical record suggests otherwise. After MKUltra was exposed, after the Church Committee revelations, after promises of reform and new oversight mechanisms, abuses continued. Different agencies, different methods, different justifications, but the same underlying disregard for civil liberties and human rights. Enhanced interrogation programs in the early 21st century employed techniques that descended directly from Cold War psychological research. Waterboarding, stress positions, sleep deprivation, temperature manipulation, sensory overload and deprivation. These methods were designed to break subjects psychologically without leaving obvious physical evidence. The parallels to MKUltra research are unmistakable. Extraordinary rendition programs kidnapped suspected terrorists and flew them to black sites in countries with fewer restrictions on interrogation methods. These facilities existed in the same legal grey zones that the safe houses of Operation Midnight Climax had occupied, places where normal rules supposedly didn't apply because the threat was too great and the circumstances too exceptional. Mass surveillance programs revealed by whistleblowers showed that intelligence agencies were collecting vast amounts of data on American citizens without warrants or meaningful oversight. The justification was always the same: national security, terrorist threats, keeping Americans safe. The programs operated in secret for years, only come into light through unauthorized disclosures rather than official channels. The pattern persists because the underlying conditions haven't changed. We still have intelligence agencies that operate primarily in secret. We still have classification systems that keep most of their activities hidden from public view. We still have oversight mechanisms that are weak, compromised, or ineffective. We still have a political culture that treats national security as a conversation-ending trump card, rather than a claim that requires rigorous justification. Operation Midnight Climax wasn't an aberration. It was a symptom of deeper structural problems that remain largely unaddressed. Until we confront those problems directly, Until we build institutional safeguards that actually prevent abuses rather than just investigating them decades after the fact, we'll keep seeing variations on the same theme. The human cost. It's easy, when discussing Operation Midnight Climax, to get lost in the policy debates and historical analysis, to treat it as an interesting case study in government overreach. But behind all of that are real people whose lives were damaged or destroyed, and their stories deserve to be remembered not as abstractions, but as human tragedies. Think about the man who entered a safe house in his 20s, excited and nervous, who spent the next 8 hours convinced he was dying or going insane, who left that apartment fundamentally changed. He struggled with flashbacks and anxiety for years afterward. Normal situations could trigger overwhelming panic. A mirror in a hotel room, jazz music in a restaurant, the smell of whiskey. His relationship suffered because he could never fully explain what was wrong, why he'd become so jumpy and paranoid. Eventually his marriage collapsed. His career stalled because employers found his behaviour erratic and unreliable. He spent decades trying to put his life back together, never fully succeeding, never understanding why a single night had demolished his psychological foundation so completely. When he finally learned about Operation Midnight Climax in the late 70s, when pieces started to fall into place and he realised what had been done to him, the revelation brought both clarity and rage. Clarity because suddenly his struggles made sense. Rage because he'd spent decades thinking something was wrong with him, when really something had been done to him. But by the time he learned the truth, the people responsible were beyond reach, the evidence was destroyed, and there was no practical recourse. Think about the woman who worked as an asset in the safe houses, bringing men back to the apartments, dosing their drinks, playing her role in the operation. She was told she was serving her country, doing important work. She needed the money. Her criminal record made regular employment nearly impossible. She convinced herself that the men being dosed were volunteers, that everyone involved understood what was happening. When she learned the truth years later, that the men had been unwitting victims, that no consent had been obtained, she was devastated. She'd participated in something monstrous while believing it was righteous. The guilt became crushing. She tried to find the men she'd lured to the apartments, to apologise, to explain, but she didn't know their names. They'd been anonymous to her, just faces that passed through, subjects in an experiment she didn't fully understand. She carried that guilt for the rest of her life, a burden made heavier by the knowledge that she too had been manipulated, used as a tool by people who'd lied to her about what was really happening. Think about the families of men who'd been dosed and never recovered, wives who watched their husbands transform into strangers, becoming paranoid and erratic for no reason they could understand. Children who grew up wondering why their father was different, why he had episodes where he seemed terrified of nothing, why he couldn't hold down a job or maintain relationships. These families were victims too, collateral damage in an experiment they didn't know existed. Some of these families spent years and small fortunes on medical treatment and therapy, trying to help their loved ones recover from trauma whose source they couldn't identify. They watched as antipsychotics and other medications provided partial relief, but never fully restored the person they'd known. They struggled with their own questions. Was this our fault? Could we have done something different? Why is this happening to us? When the truth came out, these families had their own reckoning. The person they loved hadn't been broken by some mysterious flaw or unexplained mental illness. He'd been deliberately drugged by his own government. The trauma was inflicted, not random. But this knowledge came too late to help in most cases, and there was no one to hold accountable. These aren't abstractions. They're human beings who got caught in the machinery of a program that treated them as expendable. Their stories deserve to be remembered, not as cautionary tales or political ammunition, but as reminders of what's at stake when we allow power to operate without meaningful constraints. Where are the tapes? This question haunts researchers and survivors alike. Hundreds, if not thousands of hours of footage and audio recordings were made in those safe houses. Hidden cameras captured everything. Reel-to-reel machines preserved every word. The surveillance was comprehensive, designed to document every detail of how subjects responded to the drugs. The CIA claims all of it was destroyed in the purge of 1973, boxes of film stock incinerated, magnetic tape erased, and then physically destroyed. The claim is that nothing survived, that the complete record of what happened in those apartments went up in smoke or was reduced to confetti by industrial shredders. But people who've studied intelligence agencies for decades are deeply sceptical of this claim. The historical pattern, evident across multiple agencies and countries, is that truly sensitive material doesn't get destroyed. Information that could be used as leverage, recordings that might need to be accessed later, evidence that provides insurance against betrayal, this kind of material gets hidden, secured, kept available even when official policy calls for destruction. Think about the operational logic. If you're holding footage of prominent people in deeply compromising situations, recorded without their knowledge, potentially showing them under the influence of hallucinogenic drugs engaging in behaviour they'd never want made public, you're holding enormous leverage. Why would you destroy that? It's insurance. It's a weapon. It's power in its most concrete form. There are whispers, impossible to verify through official channels, that the tapes didn't all end up in incinerators. Some allegedly found their way into private hands, parcelled out to powerful people as mutual insurance, or traded for favours in the complex economy of secrets that characterises high-level intelligence work. The logic is grimly practical. If you have blackmail material on someone influential, you don't burn it. You secure it, document its existence to the right people, and use that implicit threat to ensure cooperation or silence. There are theories that copies exist in foreign intelligence archives. If any of the people involved in Operation Midnight Climax were recruited by the KGB or other foreign intelligence services, and given the moral flexibility of those involved, this doesn't seem far-fetched. The safe house recordings would have been invaluable. Proof of American intelligence agencies running brothels on domestic soil, drugging citizens, potentially blackmailing officials. That's propaganda gold plus operational intelligence plus blackmail material, all rolled into one package. Nobody knows for sure. The CIA isn't talking beyond its official statement that the materials were destroyed. The people who might know, White, Gottlieb, the agents who worked in the safe houses, are dead or have maintained decades of silence that's unlikely to break now. Foreign intelligence services, if they have anything, certainly aren't sharing. But somewhere, possibly, those recordings still exist. Film footage of men at their most vulnerable, recorded without consent, potentially showing prominent figures in compromising positions. Audio tapes of confessions, rambling monologues, screams of terror, all preserved on magnetic ribbon. If they do exist, they represent an enormous source of potential blackmail. Control over those tapes would mean control over the people in them, and possibly control over the political and economic landscapes those people once inhabited. Even decades later, even with many of the subjects presumably dead, the recordings could still be damaging. Public figures who've built careers on particular images could be destroyed if footage surfaced showing them in situations that contradicted those images. Family members could be embarrassed or manipulated through threats of disclosure. The tapes are Schrodinger's blackmail material, simultaneously destroyed and extant, their status uncertain, but their potential impact enormous. It's entirely possible they were thoroughly destroyed as claimed. It's also possible they're sitting in a vault somewhere, a Pandora's box that nobody wants to open, because the consequences would be too destabilising, too revealing of how power actually operates beneath the public facade. This uncertainty itself is troubling. The fact that we can't know for certain what happened to evidence of massive government abuse, that the official record has been deliberately obscured, that the people responsible faced no consequences and took their secrets to their graves, all of this represents a kind of ongoing crime. The cover-up continues through silence, through the destruction of records, through the death of witnesses, through the passage of time that makes accountability increasingly impossible. Final thoughts. Operation Midnight Climax stands as one of the most disturbing episodes in American intelligence history, not just for what it was, but for what it represents about power, accountability, and the gap between democratic ideals and actual practice. The program ran for close to a decade. It dosed several thousand men without their knowledge or consent. It was funded by taxpayer money and sanctioned at the highest levels of the CIA. When it finally came to light, the response was a collective shrug followed by promises to do better. Nobody faced criminal charges. Nobody was stripped of their pension or security clearance. Nobody suffered career consequences proportional to the harm they'd inflicted. That should terrify us. Not because we can change what happened, the past is fixed and unchangeable, but because the conditions that allowed Operation Midnight Climax to happen are still largely in place. Excessive secrecy, minimal meaningful oversight, institutional cultures that prize results over ethics, the conviction that intelligence professionals operating in classified environments should be trusted to police themselves, the reflexive acceptance of national security as justification for almost anything. Until we address those structural conditions, until we create systems that actually prevent abuses rather than just investigating them decades after the fact, when everyone responsible is safely beyond accountability, we remain vulnerable to the next iteration of Operation Midnight Climax, whatever form it takes. The story doesn't end with the church committee or the declassified documents. It doesn't end with White's death or Gottlieb's quiet retirement. It continues as long as we tolerate the conditions that made it possible, as long as we accept opacity where we should demand transparency, as long as we defer to authority instead of insisting on accountability. Operation Midnight Climax is history, but it's also a warning, still relevant, still urgent, still demanding, that we pay attention to what's done in our name behind closed doors and classification stamps. Because the men who walked into those San Francisco apartments thought they were just living their lives. They had no idea they were about to become part of a secret government experiment. They had no reason to suspect that their government would do such a thing, until it did. And that's the lesson we can't afford to forget. It can happen. It did happen. And without constant vigilance, without genuine structural reform, without a commitment to accountability that goes beyond performative outrage, it will happen again. The specific tactics will change. The technology will advance. The justifications will be adapted to contemporary threats. But the underlying dynamic, power without accountability, secrecy without oversight, institutional interests prioritized over individual rights, will remain unless we collectively decide that enough is enough and demand better. What if the most dangerous secrets aren't hidden in classified files, but buried in plain sight, in the footnotes of forgotten academic papers? What if the government's most classified unit wasn't studying aliens at all, but something far more terrifying? Something that's been manipulating human belief since the dawn of civilization itself? Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to give a shout out to Jeffernan 1772 for suggesting this incredible topic. Your video ideas keep sleep theories going, so please drop your suggestions in the comments below. And if you're enjoying these deep dives into the unknown, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now let's talk about the Collins Elite, and why they might be the most important government program you've never heard of. I wasn't looking for UFOs, I was looking for a way to pay rent. The gig economy had chewed me up and spit me out more times than I cared to count. Web design, freelance writing, even a brief stint delivering food, nothing stuck. But when Dr. Martinelli at the university offered me work as a research assistant, scanning old theological dissertations for the digital archive, I jumped at it. $25 an hour to sit in a quiet library basement, copying dusty Latin passages and obscure biblical references that nobody had touched in decades. It wasn't glamorous. but it paid the bills. The work was mind-numbing mostly. Endless pages of theological debates from the 1950s and 60s, written by seminary students who are probably dead by now. The Augustinian interpretation of angelic hierarchies, post-war perspectives on demonic manifestation, scriptural analysis of divine intervention in modern context. Heavy stuff, but about as exciting as watching paint dry. I'd been at it for 3 months when I found the reference that changed everything. It was October, around 2 a.m. I was halfway through a 1963 thesis titled Angelic Manifestations in Modern Times, 324 pages of dense theological argumentation by a seminarian named Marcus Whitmore. The kind of paper that made me question every life choice that had led me to that basement. I was scanning page 187, a particularly dry section about contemporary witness testimony, when a footnote caught my eye. It wasn't the content that stopped me, it was the context. The main text was discussing reports of luminous beings witnessed by various clergy members throughout the 1950s. Standard religious stuff, the kind of mystical experiences that show up in seminary papers all the time. But the footnote read, "For governmental perspective on similar phenomena, see Collins Elite Memorandum 1957, classification status unknown." I stared at that line for a full minute. It was cited like a real source, with the matter-of-fact tone of academic reference. No explanation, no context, just there. The problem was, this wasn't a section about government or politics. It was about angels. And the thesis was written by a seminary student, not a political science major. So why was he referencing what sounded like a classified government document in the middle of a paper about divine manifestations? I made a note and kept scanning, but the reference nagged at me. Collins Elite. It sounded official, maybe military. But why would a religious scholar in 1963 have access to classified material? And why would he cite it so casually, as if his readers would know what he was talking about? The next day, I couldn't concentrate on my assigned documents. Instead, I found myself searching the university's digital catalogue for any mention of Collins Elite. Nothing came up in the main database, but I had access to some of the restricted theological archives through Dr. Martinelli's login credentials. That's where I found the second reference. It was in a 1959 lecture transcript from a Catholic seminary in Maryland. The speaker was Father Benedict Toretti, discussing unusual spiritual encounters in the post-war era. Most of the lecture was standard theological fare, but near the end, during what appeared to be an informal Q&A session, someone asked about government interest in religious phenomena. Father Toretti's response was brief but loaded. There are those in Washington who understand that not all mysteries can be solved with science. The Collins Elite represents a different approach to certain questions, but we must be careful not to mistake understanding for wisdom or documentation for truth. The transcript noted uncomfortable silence after this comment, and the lecture ended shortly thereafter. 2 references, 2 religious contexts, both suggesting that Collins Elite was some kind of government program dealing with spiritual or supernatural phenomena. But why were religious scholars the only ones talking about it? And why did they all seem nervous about it? I spent the rest of the week diving deeper into the theological archives. The pattern that emerged was both fascinating and disturbing. Collins Elite didn't show up in UFO journals or conspiracy magazines. It didn't appear in scientific papers or military histories. Instead, it haunted the footnotes of religious documents like a ghost that only clergy could see. A 1958 exorcism report from a priest in New Mexico mentioned consultation with Collins Elite regarding non-terrestrial influences. A 1962 seminary paper on demonic deception in the modern age included a cryptic reference to Collins Elite protocols for distinguishing spiritual from extraplanetary phenomena. A 1961 lecture on comparative religion contained a single chilling line. As the Collins Elite has documented, the same entities that once appeared as gods now masquerade as visitors from the stars. Each reference was brief, almost coded, Like the authors were speaking to an audience that would understand the implications without needing explanation. And always, the references appeared in contexts dealing with the supernatural, the spiritual, the otherworldly. But never in the way you'd expect. These weren't discussions of government cover-ups or alien conspiracies. They were warnings. Theological warnings about deception, about false prophets, about entities that wore whatever mask humanity was willing to believe. I was starting to get a picture of something much stranger than a typical black project. Collins' elite wasn't studying UFOs the way the Air Force was. They were studying them the way the Catholic Church studied demons. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a misfiled document. I was scanning a collection of 1964 seminary papers when I found something that didn't belong. Mixed in with discussions of Vatican II reforms and modern catechism was a single-page document that looked nothing like the others. It was typed on official letterhead, something called Interdenominational Council on Anomalous Phenomena, and dated March 15th, 1959. The document was brief. Memo. Regarding recent Collins Elite Briefing 2, member institutions from Council Secretary following last week's presentation by Dr. Edward Collins regarding non-corporeal intelligence manifestations. The Council recommends the following protocols for clergy encountering anomalous phenomena. Do not assume extraterrestrial origin 2. Apply traditional discernment practices 3. Document all encounters per Collins Elite Guidelines 4. Report suspected deception campaigns immediately. Remember, the same entities that demanded worship as Baal and Moloch now request our trust as benevolent space brothers. The mask changes, the deception remains constant. Father Michael Torino, Council Secretary. My hands were shaking as I read it. This wasn't just a reference to Collins Elite. This was evidence of direct collaboration between the program and religious institutions. They were briefing clergy on how to handle UFO encounters, but from a theological perspective. And that last paragraph, it was suggesting that UFO entities weren't aliens at all. They were something much older and more dangerous, masquerading as extraterrestrials just as they had once masqueraded as ancient gods. I photographed the document with my phone and started digging into this interdenominational council. What I found made my blood run cold. The Interdenominational Council on Anomalous Phenomena existed from 1957 to 1969, according to what little I could find. Its membership included representatives from major Christian denominations, Jewish religious authorities, and even some Islamic scholars. The council was supposedly formed to coordinate religious response to unusual phenomena in the post-war era. That was the official line anyway. The reality appeared to be much more specific. I found meeting minutes from 1958 that discussed the Collins Elite presentation on entity communication patterns. A 1960 report mentioned successful implementation of Collins Elite discernment protocols in 17 states. A 1962 memorandum warned of increased entity activity coinciding with popular UFO narratives. The council wasn't just studying religious phenomena in general. They were specifically focused on what they called entity encounters, and they were working directly with Collins Elite to develop responses. The most disturbing document I found was a 1961 report titled Spiritual Warfare in the Space Age. It outlined what the Council believed to be a deliberate deception campaign by non-human entities. Historical analysis suggests consistent behavioural patterns across millennia. Entities appearing as divine beings in ancient times demanded worship, sacrifice, and absolute obedience. Modern manifestations as space visitors request trust, cooperation, and technological exchange. The underlying objective, human subjugation, remains unchanged. The report went on to detail specific cases where UFO contactees had reported entities claiming to be from various star systems, but whose messages contained elements identical to ancient religious texts describing demonic deception. According to the Council's analysis, the entities were running the same con they'd always run. They just updated their costumes for each era. As I dug deeper into the Council's documents, I started to notice something unsettling. My research wasn't going unnoticed. It started small. Dr. Martinelli mentioned that someone had been asking about my work. Just routine monitoring, he said, but he looked uncomfortable about it. Then I noticed that some of the documents I'd photographed were being moved to different sections of the archive. Files that had been easily accessible suddenly required special permission to view. The final warning came on a Tuesday night in November. I was alone in the archive basement scanning a particularly interesting 1963 document about Collins Elite Field Operations when my computer screen flickered. The document disappeared, replaced by a simple text message. "Stop looking, they're not what you think." I stared at the screen, heart pounding. Someone was monitoring my research in real time. Someone with access to the university's network, and probably a lot more than that. I should have stopped then. Any reasonable person would have backed off, found a different job, maybe moved to a different city. But I wasn't reasonable anymore. I was obsessed, and besides, whoever was watching had just confirmed that I was onto something real. I replied by typing into the same text box that had appeared on my screen. "Then what are they?" The response came immediately. "They've worn every mask we've ever worshipped." The screen flickered again, and the message disappeared. But the implication was crystal clear. Collins Elite wasn't just studying UFO entities. They'd concluded that these entities were the same beings that had manipulated human religious belief throughout history. Ancient gods, modern aliens, same entities, different costumes. After the warning, access to documents became nearly impossible. Files went missing. Archives were suddenly under renovation. Dr. Martinelli stopped returning my emails. It was clear that my research had triggered some kind of response from whoever wanted Collins Elite to remain buried. But I'd already seen enough to piece together the broad outline of their doctrine. Collins Elite appeared to be a small classified unit within the US government that approached the UFO phenomenon from a religious rather than scientific perspective. Based on the scattered evidence I'd found, their core beliefs seemed to be UFO entities were not extraterrestrial visitors. They were the same non-corporeal beings that had interacted with humans throughout history. These entities had consistently masqueraded as whatever humans were most likely to worship or trust. Their ultimate goal was the spiritual subjugation of humanity. The modern UFO phenomenon was simply their latest deception campaign. The unit apparently worked closely with religious leaders to develop protocols for identifying and resisting entity influence. They studied religious texts not for historical interest, but for tactical intelligence about entity behaviour patterns. They viewed exorcists and clergy as frontline personnel in a spiritual war that most people didn't even know was happening. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to believe they were losing. My research into Collins Elite had taken nearly 6 months, and by December I was running out of leads. The documents had dried up, my access was severely restricted, and I was starting to wonder if I'd ever find anything more concrete than footnotes and oblique references. That's when I decided to look at modern UFO phenomena through the Collins Elite lens. What I found was terrifying in its consistency. Contemporary UFO contactee reports, when examined from a religious perspective, showed the same patterns that Collins Elite had apparently identified in the 1950s. Entities claiming to be from Zeta Reticuli or the Pleiades, but whose messages contained elements identical to ancient Gnostic texts. Space Brothers, preaching salvation through technological advancement, using language that echoed Mesopotamian religious propaganda. Abduction experiences that followed the same psychological patterns as historical demonic possession cases. The modern UFO disclosure movement, viewed through Collins Elite's framework, looked less like a quest for scientific truth and more like the latest phase of an ancient deception campaign. Entities that had once demanded worship as gods now requested trust as benevolent aliens. Same control mechanisms, updated for a scientific age. I started to understand why Collins Elite had worked so closely with religious authorities. If you believe that UFO entities were actually spiritual beings with thousands of years of experience in manipulating human belief systems, then scientists and military analysts were the wrong people to study them. You needed theologians. You needed people who understood the long history of spiritual deception and the psychological mechanisms of faith. You needed people who could recognize the same lie being told with new words. I thought I'd reached the end of my research when I received an unexpected email in January. The sender was listed as archive.recovery@gmail.com, obviously a throwaway account. The message was brief. You've been asking the right questions. Room 847, basement level, manuscript collection. Look behind the Milton volumes. 1 hour only. I almost deleted it. Every instinct told me it was a trap, but the Collins Elite investigation had become an obsession, and I couldn't walk away from what might be my last chance at finding real answers. An hour later, I was in the basement of the manuscript collection, a building I'd never visited before. Room 847 was a cramped storage room filled with old books and filing cabinets. The Milton volumes were easy to find, a complete set of Paradise Lost editions dating back to the 1800s. Behind the books, taped to the back of the shelf, was a manila envelope. Inside was a single document that changed everything I thought I knew about Collins Elite. It was typed on official US government letterhead, dated August 12, 1969, and marked Eyes Only Collins Elite Termination Report. The document was brief but explosive. Memorandum for the record subject: termination of Collins Elite program. Effective immediately. All Collins Elite operations are suspended indefinitely. Program termination follows unanimous recommendation by Collins Elite senior staff. Reason for termination: successful entity infiltration of program hierarchy. Evidence suggests long-term entity influence over program direction since 1961. Collins Elite conclusions regarding entity nature remain valid. However, program itself has been compromised beyond recovery. All Collins Elite personnel are reassigned. All documents classified at highest levels. Religious community partnerships terminated. Interdenominational council dissolved. Public disclosure of Collins Elite findings is prohibited under national security provisions. Final assessment: the entities we sought to understand and counter have proven more sophisticated than anticipated. They have successfully used our own investigation against us, turning our knowledge into a tool for their agenda. The Collins Elite program has become part of the deception we were created to expose. Any future investigation of these phenomena must proceed under the assumption that traditional government and academic institutions are compromised. Minus Dr. Edward Collins, Program Director. I read the document 3 times before the implication sank in. Collins Elite hadn't just been terminated because of budget cuts or bureaucratic reshuffling. It had been terminated because the entities they were studying had infiltrated and co-opted the program itself. The Watchers had been turned into accomplices, and if that was true in 1969, what did it mean for every government UFO program since then? Sitting in that storage room, holding what might be the last authentic Collins Elite document ever created, I finally understood the true scope of what I'd uncovered. Collins Elite hadn't been a fringe program run by religious zealots. It had been a serious government investigation that reached a conclusion so disturbing that the entities being studied had been forced to destroy it. The program had gotten too close to the truth, so the truth had destroyed the program. But what was that truth? Based on everything I'd found, Collins Elite had concluded that the UFO phenomenon was not extraterrestrial contact, but rather the latest phase of an ancient psychological operation. Non-corporeal entities, call them demons, call them interdimensional beings, call them whatever you want, had been manipulating human belief systems for millennia. They had appeared as gods to ancient peoples, demanding worship and sacrifice. They had manifested as angels and devils to medieval societies, shaping religious doctrine. And now they were appearing as alien visitors to a technological civilization, promoting their agenda through the language of science and space exploration. The genius of it was that each generation thought they were encountering something new. Ancient peoples saw divine visitation. Medieval believers saw spiritual manifestation. Modern witnesses see extraterrestrial contact. But according to Collins Elite, it was always the same entities, always running the same basic deception, always working toward the same goal, the spiritual and psychological subjugation of humanity. The entities had realised that direct worship was no longer feasible in a scientific age, so they had adapted, presenting themselves as technologically advanced aliens who could offer humanity salvation through scientific advancement. Instead of demanding worship, they requested trust. Instead of requiring sacrifice, they asked for cooperation. But the underlying dynamic remained the same: humans giving up their autonomy to beings who claimed to have their best interests at heart. And if Collins' elite was right, the modern UFO disclosure movement was simply the latest phase of this deception campaign. The termination document explained why I'd never heard of Collins' elite in any mainstream UFO research. It wasn't being covered up by the government to hide alien contact. It was being covered up because the government itself had been compromised by the entities Collins' elite were studying. Think about it. Every major government UFO program since Collins' elite, Project Blue Book, AA-TIP, the UAP task force, had approached the phenomenon from a purely technological perspective. They studied craft capabilities, flight patterns, potential propulsion systems. They never asked the questions Collins' elite had been asking. What do these entities actually want? Why do their messages always promote dependence rather than independence? Why do their promises of enlightenment always require surrender of human agency? Those questions weren't being ignored by accident. According to the termination document, they were being actively suppressed by entities who had learned to work within government and academic institutions. The modern UFO research community, the disclosure advocates, the scientists studying anomalous aerial phenomena, they might all be sincere in their efforts, but they were asking the wrong questions. They were looking for extraterrestrial contact when they should have been looking for spiritual deception. And that meant that every major UFO revelation of the past 50 years might actually be part of the deception Collins' elite had tried to expose. I left that storage room with more questions than answers, but one thing was crystal clear. Collins' elite had tried to warn us, and we hadn't listened. Worse, we might not be capable of listening, because the entities they warned us about had apparently learned to control the conversation. Over the following weeks, I tried to verify the termination document through official channels. I filed Freedom of Information Act requests. I contacted government historians. I reached out to former intelligence officials. The responses were universally the same. No record of any program called Collins' Elite existed in official government files. But that didn't mean the program had never existed. It just meant that someone had been very thorough in erasing it. The more I thought about it, the more the Collins' elite scenario made sense of things that had always bothered me about the UFO phenomenon. Why did entity messages always promote technological dependence rather than spiritual development? Why did alien contact always require humans to abandon their traditional belief systems? Why did every promised revelation turn out to be just another layer of mystery? According to Collins' elite, it was because the entities weren't trying to enlighten us. They were trying to control us. And the best way to control a technologically advanced species was to convince them that salvation could only come through higher technology, provided by beings who claimed to have humanity's best interests at heart. The ancient formula updated for a scientific age. After finding the termination document, I thought my Collins' elite investigation was over, but 2 weeks later, I received another cryptic email from the same archive. Recovery account. You found the termination report. Good. Now find the real archive. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, Georgetown University Theology Department. Tell her Marcus sent you. I almost ignored it. The rational part of my brain was screaming that I was already in too deep, that whoever was feeding me information might be leading me into something dangerous. But the name Marcus rang a bell. Marcus Whitmore, the author of that first 1963 thesis, where I'd found the Collins' elite reference. Could he still be alive? Dr. Rodriguez's office was in a converted Victorian house on the Georgetown campus, tucked between the main theology building and an old chapel. When I mentioned that Marcus had sent me, her reaction was immediate and alarming. She locked her office door, closed the blinds, and pulled out a device I later learned was a radio frequency detector. 62 years, she said quietly, sweeping the device around the room. 62 years Marcus has been waiting for someone to follow the trail far enough to find him. He's 91 years old and still afraid they're listening. Dr. Rodriguez led me through a maze of basement corridors beneath the theology building to a climate-controlled storage room I never could have found on my own. Inside, Marcus Whitmore sat surrounded by filing cabinets that looked like they'd been moved there decades ago. He was ancient, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "You're the one asking about Collins Elite," he said. It wasn't a question. "Eleanor tells me you found the termination report. That means they decided you were ready." "They?" "The survivors. The ones who got out before the infiltration was complete." He gestured to the filing cabinets around us. "We've been maintaining our own archive for over 50 years. Everything the government tried to bury, we preserved. What Marcus showed me over the next 6 hours changed everything I thought I knew about Collins Elite and about the scope of the deception they had uncovered. Collins Elite hadn't begun as a government program at all. It had started in 1947 as an informal network of military officers, intelligence analysts and religious scholars who were disturbed by early UFO reports. What bothered them wasn't the craft themselves, but the messages being delivered by the entities inside them. The contactee movement was just getting started, Marcus explained, pulling out files from the late 1940s. George Adamski, Daniel Fry, Truman Bethurum, all these people claiming contact with benevolent space brothers. But when you analysed their messages from a theological perspective, they weren't promoting human spiritual development. They were promoting dependence. The early Collins Elite had conducted detailed analyses of contactee messages and found disturbing patterns. The entities consistently promoted several key themes: the inadequacy of human religion, the necessity of technological advancement, the benefits of surrendering human decision-making to superior beings, and the dangers of independent spiritual development. It was the same psychological framework used by every cult in history, Dr. Rodriguez added. Isolate the subject from their support systems, convince them that traditional sources of guidance are inadequate, then position yourself as the only reliable source of truth. But Collins Elite's analysis went deeper than simple cult mechanics. They had identified specific linguistic and conceptual patterns that appeared across different contactee cases, patterns that matched historical accounts of demonic deception dating back thousands of years. Marcus showed me a 1952 analysis comparing Adamski's alleged conversations with Venusian beings to transcripts from 16th century witch trials. The parallels were undeniable. The same promises of secret knowledge, the same dismissal of conventional morality, the same emphasis on the chosen status of the contactee. That's when we knew we were dealing with something ancient, Marcus said. These weren't aliens from space. They were the same entities that had been manipulating human belief systems since the beginning of recorded history. By 1957, Collins Elite had attracted official government attention. The CIA and military intelligence were struggling to understand the UFO phenomenon from a technological perspective, but Collins Elite was approaching it from an entirely different angle and getting results. We could predict contactee behaviour patterns, Dr. Rodriguez explained. We could identify which cases were likely to be genuine entity contact versus hoaxes or psychological episodes. We could even predict what messages the entities would deliver in future contacts. This predictive ability had made Collins Elite invaluable to government agencies dealing with UFO incidents. But it had also made them a target. Marcus pulled out a thick file labelled Entity Response Patterns, 1958 to 1961. Inside were dozens of reports documenting how UFO activity and contactee experiences changed in response to Collins Elite investigations. Whenever we got too close to exposing their methods, they would shift tactics, Marcus said. Study their linguistic patterns too closely, and suddenly contactees would start receiving messages in completely different styles. Document their technological claims, and they would start demonstrating entirely different capabilities. The entities weren't just running a deception campaign. They were actively monitoring the investigators and adapting their approach in real time. But the most disturbing pattern was personal targeting. Collins Elite members began experiencing their own anomalous encounters, but these experiences were clearly designed to discredit or manipulate the investigators, rather than provide genuine contact. Dr. Edward Collins himself was contacted in 1960, Marcus revealed. The entity claimed to be from Rigel and offered to provide him with advanced technology in exchange for shutting down the Collins Elite program. When he refused, the encounters became increasingly threatening. Other Collins Elite members reported similar experiences, contact attempts that seemed designed to either co-opt them or drive them out of the program entirely. The entities were fighting back. The termination document I'd found told only part of the story. The real disaster began in 1961 when Collins Elite was formally incorporated into the government's UFO investigation apparatus. "That was our mistake," Marcus said bitterly. "We thought official recognition would give us more resources, better access to witness testimony, protection from entity retaliation. Instead, it gave them access to us." With official status came new personnel assignments, government oversight, and integration with other classified programs. Collins Elite's small, tight-knit network of trusted researchers was suddenly flooded with new members whose backgrounds couldn't be thoroughly vetted. The infiltration was subtle at first, Dr. Rodriguez explained. New analysts who would subtly shift the focus of investigations, administrative personnel who would lose crucial documents, supervisors who would redirect resources toward more promising lines of inquiry. By 1965, original Collins Elite members were reporting that their research conclusions were being systematically altered before reaching higher-level officials. Analyses emphasizing the deceptive nature of entity contact were being rewritten to focus on potential technological benefits. Warnings about spiritual manipulation were being deleted entirely. Marcus showed me internal memos from 1966 to 1968, documenting the growing suspicion among original Collins Elite members that their program had been compromised. They began conducting parallel investigations using secure channels, trying to determine whether the infiltration was the result of foreign intelligence operations, bureaucratic incompetence, or something more sinister. By 1968, we had our answer, Marcus said grimly. It was the entities themselves. They had learned to work through human intermediaries, people who might not even be consciously aware that they were being influenced. The evidence was subtle but damning. New Collins Elite personnel consistently made decisions that served entity interests, redirecting investigations away from deception analysis, promoting contactees who delivered pro-entity messages, suppressing research that exposed manipulation tactics. The final proof came when Dr. Collins tried to present his findings to the Defense Intelligence Agency in 1969, Dr. Rodriguez said. His presentation was completely rewritten between the time he submitted it and the time it was delivered. Instead of warning about entity deception, it recommended increased cooperation with UFO intelligences. That was when the original Collins Elite members realized their program had been completely subverted. The Watchers had become the watched, and the watched had become the watchers. Rather than fight a battle they couldn't win within government channels, the original Collins Elite members made a radical decision. They would fake the program's termination while secretly continuing their research through private channels. The termination report you found was genuine, Marcus explained, but it wasn't the end of Collins Elite. It was the beginning of the real investigation. Using their existing contacts within religious institutions, academia and government, the Collins Elite survivors established a covert network for continuing their research. They couldn't publish their findings or seek official recognition, but they could continue gathering evidence and developing their understanding of the entity deception campaign. "We've been operating continuously for over 50 years, Dr. Rodriguez said, documenting entity activity, analysing their evolving strategies, tracking their infiltration of various institutions. The underground Collins Elite had identified several key developments since 1969. The entities had largely abandoned individual contactee operations in favour of influencing institutions directly. Rather than delivering messages through isolated individuals who could be easily dismissed, they were now working through respected scientists, government officials and religious leaders. They had also shifted their primary narrative from spiritual enlightenment to technological salvation. Instead of promising cosmic consciousness or spiritual advancement, they were now focusing on environmental solutions, clean energy, and space exploration. Most significantly, they had begun preparing for mass disclosure rather than gradual revelation. The underground Collins elite believed this represented the final phase of a deception campaign that had been in development for decades. Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez walked me through 50 years of documented entity influence on human institutions. The pattern was consistent but sophisticated. Entities never directly controlled human behaviour, but they influenced it through carefully orchestrated synchronicities, technological inspirations, and strategic information releases. "Look at the development of computer technology," Dr. Rodriguez said, showing me files documenting unusual technological leaps in electronics and computing since the 1960s. Every major breakthrough happened shortly after UFO encounters involving personnel who were in positions to influence research directions. The entities weren't providing blueprints or direct technological assistance. Instead, they were inspiring specific lines of research, guiding human scientists toward discoveries that served long-term entity interests. The internet, social media, artificial intelligence, all of these technologies have made humanity more connected but also more controllable, Marcus observed. They've created systems that can monitor and influence human behaviour on a global scale. According to underground Collins elite analysis, the entities had been systematically encouraging the development of technologies that would make mass psychological manipulation easier, while simultaneously making individual privacy and independence more difficult. But the most disturbing revelation was their analysis of the modern UFO disclosure movement itself. Every major disclosure advocate, every government whistleblower, every scientist calling for serious UFO research, we've documented anomalous encounters in their backgrounds, Dr. Rodriguez said. They're not consciously working for the entities, but they're all promoting the same basic narrative, that UFO contact is inevitable, beneficial, and should be embraced rather than resisted. The underground Collins elite had identified specific psychological themes being promoted through disclosure advocates: the inadequacy of human civilization, the necessity of outside intervention, the benefits of technological advancement over spiritual development, and the dangers of resistance to contact. It's the same message the contactees were delivering in the 1950s, Marcus said, just delivered through more credible sources and backed by more sophisticated evidence. According to the underground Collins elite's analysis, the current disclosure campaign was preparation for something unprecedented: open entity contact with humanity as a whole, rather than selected individuals. They've spent 70 years testing human responses, refining their approach, identifying the most effective manipulation strategies, Dr. Rodriguez explained. Now they're ready to scale up. The evidence they showed me was circumstantial but compelling. Government UFO programs consistently focused on technological aspects while ignoring behavioural and psychological elements. Scientific studies of anomalous phenomena emphasized physical measurements, while dismissing witness testimony about entity motivations. Media coverage promoted wonder and excitement about potential contact, while discouraging analysis of entity intentions. They're engineering consent, Marcus said, creating a cultural context where open contact will be seen as humanity's graduation to a higher level of existence rather than submission to a superior intelligence. The underground Collins elite believed that formal contact would be presented as humanity's invitation to join a galactic community, with entities offering technological solutions to environmental problems, social conflicts, and resource limitations. The offer would seem generous, beneficial, and desperately needed. But according to their analysis, acceptance would come with costs that wouldn't become apparent until it was too late. The gradual replacement of human decision-making systems with entity-guided alternatives, the erosion of individual agency in favour of collective efficiency, and the redefinition of human spiritual development to align with entity objectives. It won't feel like conquest, Dr. Rodriguez said. It will feel like salvation, right up until the moment humans realise they've traded their freedom for security, and they're no longer capable of making that trade in reverse. After hours of reviewing evidence and analysis, I asked the obvious question: if the underground Collins elite was right about entity intentions, what could be done to counter them? Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez exchanged glances before Marcus answered carefully. Individual resistance is possible but difficult, he said. The entities rely on collective consent and institutional cooperation. They can't force contact on humans who genuinely reject it, but they can make such rejection seem irrational, antisocial or harmful. The underground Collins elite had developed what they called spiritual inoculation, techniques for recognizing and resisting entity influence. These included traditional religious practices like prayer and meditation, but also more analytical approaches, questioning the source and motivation behind any message promoting dependence, examining whether proposed solutions increased or decreased human agency, and maintaining strong connections to human community and traditional wisdom. The entities are masters of isolation and dependency, Dr. Rodriguez explained. Their influence is weakest when humans are connected to each other and to their own spiritual traditions, and strongest when individuals feel cut off from community and traditional sources of guidance. But individual resistance wouldn't be enough if the entities succeeded in achieving mass consent for contact. The underground Collins elite believed that their most important function was preserving and disseminating knowledge about entity deception methods, so that future generations would have the tools needed to recognize and resist manipulation. That's why we've maintained this archive, Marcus said, and why we're sharing it with you now. The disclosure campaign is accelerating, and we may not have much time left to prepare people for what's coming. As I write this, the UFO disclosure movement is reaching a crescendo. Government officials are admitting that anomalous aerial phenomena are real. Military personnel are testifying about encounters with craft displaying impossible capabilities. Scientists are calling for serious study of the phenomenon. The public is being prepared for some kind of revelation. But if Collins' elite was right, that revelation might be the culmination of a deception campaign that began thousands of years ago. Think about how perfectly the current disclosure narrative fits the Collins elite framework. We're being told that non-human intelligence has been monitoring humanity, that these beings possess technology that could solve our energy and environmental problems, that contact is inevitable and potentially beneficial. We're being encouraged to view disclosure as a positive development, a step forward in human evolution. But what if it's actually the final step in a plan that began when the first human looked at the sky and wondered if the gods were watching? The entities Collins' elite studied had thousands of years to perfect their understanding of human psychology. They knew that direct domination would eventually fail, that humans would rebel against obvious tyranny, but they also knew that humans could be convinced to surrender their autonomy willingly, if the surrender was framed as enlightenment or advancement. The promise of godhood had worked for ancient peoples, the promise of salvation had worked for medieval societies, and the promise of technological transcendence might be working on us right now. Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez had given me a framework for understanding the entity deception campaign, but they also gave me something more practical, a list of specific indicators that the final phase was beginning. We've been tracking these markers for decades, Dr. Rodriguez explained, showing me a comprehensive timeline of predicted developments. When all of them align, it means the entities believe humanity is ready for open contact. The first indicator was mainstream media normalization of UFO phenomena, not just reporting on UFO incidents, but actively promoting the idea that contact would be beneficial. According to their analysis, this phase had begun in earnest around 2017 and was accelerating rapidly. The second indicator was government disclosure of UAP reality without disclosure of government conclusions about entity intentions. They're admitting the phenomena are real, while carefully avoiding any discussion of what the entities actually want, Marcus noted. This creates public curiosity without public wariness. The third indicator was increased entity activity designed to demonstrate technological superiority while maintaining plausible deniability. The recent UAP videos released by the Pentagon fit this pattern perfectly. Clear evidence of advanced technology, but no direct communication or obvious threat. The fourth indicator was the emergence of credible advocates for contact within scientific, military, and government institutions. People with impressive credentials and no obvious ulterior motives, all promoting the same basic message: that humanity should welcome contact rather than fear it. Look at the current disclosure advocates, Dr. Rodriguez said, showing me biographical information on various scientists and former government officials. Impressive backgrounds, sincere motivations, reasonable arguments, but they're all promoting the same narrative the entities have been pushing for 70 years. The fifth and most disturbing indicator was the systematic suppression of research into entity psychology and motivations. While technological aspects of UAP were receiving increased attention and funding, questions about entity intentions were being dismissed as unscientific or irrelevant. That's how you know the entities are controlling the conversation, Marcus said. Any investigation that might reveal their true agenda gets discredited or defunded, while investigations that support their preferred narrative receive institutional support. According to their tracking system, all 5 indicators were currently active and accelerating. The underground Collins elite believed this meant humanity was within years, possibly months, of formal entity contact. Before I left Georgetown that day, Marcus pulled me aside for a private conversation. "You need to understand what you're walking into," he said quietly. "Everyone who's gotten this deep into Collins elite research has faced the same choice. Drop the investigation or accept that your life is going to change in ways you can't predict or control." He told me about colleagues who had been discredited through carefully orchestrated academic scandals, researchers who had lost funding after questioning entity motivations, investigators who had experienced personal crises that conveniently redirected their attention away from UFO phenomena. The entities don't usually resort to direct intimidation, Marcus explained. It's much more effective to make resistance seem personally costly. Failed relationships, career setbacks, health problems, family conflicts, all timed to coincide with getting too close to the truth. He showed me files documenting the life trajectories of dozens of Collins elite researchers over the past 50 years. The pattern was consistent. People who backed away from the investigation generally experienced improved circumstances, while those who continued faced escalating personal difficulties. "I'm not trying to scare you off," Marcus said, "but you need to know that this isn't just an intellectual exercise. The entities have a vested interest in controlling what humans believe about them, and they've had centuries to develop sophisticated methods for managing troublesome individuals." Dr. Rodriguez had faced similar pressures. Her tenure at Georgetown had been threatened twice due to budget constraints that mysteriously resolved themselves when she temporarily reduced her Collins elite research. Her marriage had ended during a period of intensive investigation into entity influence on religious institutions. Her health had suffered during the years she was most actively documenting entity deception patterns. "But here's the thing," she said. "The difficulties are real, but they're not insurmountable. The entities can make resistance costly, but they can't make it impossible. If they could simply eliminate troublesome humans, Collins elite would never have existed in the first place." She believed that entity limitations were precisely why the deception campaign was necessary. If entities could control human behavior directly, they wouldn't need to spend decades engineering consent for contact. The fact that they relied on manipulation suggested that human free will, while vulnerable to influence, remained fundamentally intact. Over the following months, Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez introduced me to other members of the underground Collins elite network. I was amazed by both the size and diversity of the group. Theologians and physicists, former intelligence analysts and current religious leaders, retired military officers and active researchers. What united them wasn't a shared background or ideology, but a shared conclusion that the UFO phenomenon represented a spiritual threat masquerading as a technological opportunity. Father Michael Torres, a Catholic exorcist based in New Mexico, had been documenting parallels between UFO encounters and demonic possession for 30 years. Dr. Rebecca Walsh, a psychiatrist specializing in religious experiences, had identified specific psychological patterns linking modern abduction accounts to historical accounts of spiritual deception. Colonel James Patterson, retired, former Air Force intelligence, had spent decades analyzing UFO incident reports and concluded that entity behavior was consistent with psychological warfare rather than scientific exploration. Each member of the network brought specialized knowledge and perspective, but all had reached similar conclusions about entity motivations and methods. More importantly, All had experienced some form of pressure or retaliation for their research, confirming the underground Collins elite's assessment that entity influence extended far beyond individual contactee cases. "We're not conspiracy theorists," Dr. Walsh explained during one of our meetings. "We're researchers who followed the evidence to an uncomfortable conclusion. The UFO phenomenon is real, the entities are real, but their intentions aren't what they claim to be." The network had developed sophisticated methods for secure communication and information sharing, operating on the assumption that their activities were being monitored by both government agencies and entity-influenced individuals within those agencies. "We have to assume that any information we share through normal channels will be compromised," Colonel Patterson explained. "But we also can't become so paranoid that we stop sharing information entirely. The entities benefit from our isolation more than our communication." As my involvement with the underground Collins elite deepened, I learned that the network extended far beyond the United States. Religious leaders in Europe, researchers in Asia, indigenous spiritual authorities in South America, all were reporting similar observations about entity activity and deception patterns. Dr. Rodriguez arranged for me to speak with several international contacts via encrypted communication channels. Their perspectives added crucial context to the Collins elite analysis. Brother Antonio Mendez, a Spanish monk who specialized in mystical theology, had been tracking entity influences on contemporary religious movements. His research suggested that entities were actively promoting syncretistic spiritual practices that emphasized cosmic consciousness over traditional religious authority. "They're not attacking religion directly," he explained through a translator. "They're subtly altering it, encouraging beliefs and practices that make humans more receptive to entity guidance and less connected to traditional sources of spiritual wisdom." Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a Japanese researcher studying anomalous phenomena in Buddhist contexts, had identified similar patterns in Asian spiritual communities. Entity influences seem designed to promote meditation practices that open practitioners to external guidance, while discouraging those that strengthened individual discernment and spiritual independence. Maria Santos, a shaman from Peru, described entity encounters that closely paralleled North American UFO contact reports, but framed in terms of traditional indigenous spirituality. The entities consistently promoted abandonment of ancestral traditions in favour of updated spiritual practices more suitable for the modern world. "Same spirits, different masks," she said simply. "They tell each culture what that culture wants to hear, but always with the same goal: make humans depend on them instead of their own traditions and wisdom." The global perspective confirmed the underground Collins elite's assessment that entity activity was coordinated across cultures and belief systems, but adapted to local contexts and expectations. The deception campaign wasn't centered in any particular country or religion. It was targeting human spiritual independence as a universal phenomenon. Based on decades of analysis and current trends, the underground Collins elite had developed a timeline for what they believed would be the final phase of the entity deception campaign. Phase 1, 2020 to 2025, mainstream normalization of UFO phenomena through government disclosure and media coverage. Emphasis on technological aspects while avoiding discussion of entity psychology or motivations. Gradual preparation of public consciousness for the possibility of contact. Phase 2, 2025 to 2030. Increased entity demonstrations designed to showcase technological capabilities and benevolent intentions, possibly including solutions to environmental or energy crises that humanity appears unable to solve independently. Growing public pressure for government contact initiatives. Phase 3, 2030 to 2035, formal contact between entity representatives and human governments. Presentation of comprehensive assistance packages addressing climate change, resource depletion, social conflicts and technological limitations. Initial agreements for limited cooperation and information exchange. Phase 4, 2035 to 2040. Gradual integration of entity guidance into human decision-making systems, replacement of traditional political, economic and social structures with entity-recommended alternatives, growing human dependence on entity technology and advice. Phase 5, 2040 plus, complete transformation of human civilization according to entity specifications, elimination of independent human spiritual development in favour of entity-directed consciousness evolution, humanity's transition from independent species to managed resource. The genius of the timeline is that each phase will seem like humanity's choice, Dr. Rodriguez explained. People will vote for leaders who support contact. They'll demand access to entity technology. They'll embrace changes that make their lives easier and more comfortable. Marcus nodded grimly. By the time humans realize they've traded their freedom for security, the infrastructure for independence will have been dismantled. They'll be completely dependent on systems they don't understand, controlled by entities they trusted. The timeline wasn't inevitable, according to Underground Collins' elite analysis, but it was highly probable unless humanity developed widespread awareness of entity deception methods and conscious resistance to manipulation. That's why we're talking to you, Marcus said, and why we've been talking to researchers like you for 50 years. Information is the only weapon we have against this kind of psychological operation. After months of research and analysis, I found myself facing the same choice that every Collins elite researcher had faced since 1947. Accept the implications of what I'd learned, or find a way to dismiss it as paranoid speculation. The evidence was circumstantial but extensive. The pattern was consistent but complex. The implications were staggering but difficult to prove conclusively, and the personal costs of continued investigation were becoming increasingly apparent. My freelance work had dried up mysteriously. Dr. Martinelli had stopped returning my calls after someone complained about my misuse of university resources. My relationship was suffering under the strain of the long hours spent on research I couldn't fully explain. My sleep was disrupted by dreams that felt more like memories of conversations I'd never had. But I also couldn't ignore what I'd learned. If Collins' elite was even partially correct, then humanity was walking into the most sophisticated trap in recorded history. And if that trap succeeded, future generations would live in a world where human independence was not just restricted, but literally unthinkable. The choice, ultimately, was between personal comfort and collective responsibility, between individual security and species survival, between the easy path of accepting official narratives and the difficult path of questioning everything I thought I knew about humanity's place in the universe. I chose to continue the investigation. It's been 6 months since my first meeting with Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez, and I'm no longer the same person who stumbled across that footnote in a theological dissertation. The evidence I've gathered has convinced me that Collins' elite was not only real, but correct in their fundamental assessment of the UFO phenomenon. We are not being visited by benevolent space brothers seeking to help humanity evolve to a higher level of consciousness. We are being manipulated by entities that have been perfecting deception techniques for millennia, entities that view humanity as a resource to be managed rather than a species to be assisted. The current UFO disclosure movement, whatever the sincere intentions of its individual advocates, is serving entity interests by preparing humanity to welcome contact rather than question it. The technological solutions being offered through various contact scenarios are not gifts, but baits in an elaborate trap that will close once humanity becomes dependent on entity guidance. And the most terrifying aspect is that it's working exactly as planned. Public opinion is shifting in favour of contact. Government agencies are admitting UFO reality while avoiding UFO psychology. Scientific institutions are studying technological aspects while ignoring behavioural patterns. Religious leaders are embracing cosmic spirituality while abandoning traditional discernment practices. We are being prepared for our own subjugation, and we are enthusiastically participating in the preparation process. But knowledge of a deception campaign, even a sophisticated one, provides power to resist it. The entities Collins' elite studied were powerful and cunning, but they were not omnipotent. Their influence depended on human ignorance, isolation, and consent. When humans understood their methods and refused to cooperate, entity influence diminished significantly. The underground Collins elite has spent 50 years documenting entity weaknesses as well as their strengths. They've developed techniques for recognizing and resisting manipulation. They've maintained networks of communication and support that entity influence cannot completely penetrate, and most importantly, they've preserved knowledge that would otherwise have been lost or corrupted. That knowledge is now available to anyone willing to look for it, question official narratives, and think independently about humanity's future. The choice between freedom and security, between independence and dependence, between human agency and entity guidance remains open. But that choice won't remain open forever. According to every timeline the underground Collins elite has developed, we are rapidly approaching the point where collective consent for entity contact will make individual resistance increasingly difficult and ultimately ineffective. The time for choosing is now. The information needed to choose wisely exists, but it requires effort to find and courage to accept. The consequences of choosing poorly may be irreversible. 60 years ago, Collins' elite tried to warn us. Today, their successors are still trying. Whether humanity listens and whether we choose wisely remains to be seen. But the warning has been delivered. The evidence has been presented. The choice is ours. Maybe that's why you never hear their name in congressional hearings or disclosure reports, because Collins' elite wasn't warning us about aliens. They were warning us about faith in the wrong thing, and how easily it can damn us. The question isn't whether Collins' elite really existed. The question is whether they were right. And if they were right, then everything we think we know about the UFO phenomenon might be part of the very deception they tried to expose. The entities they described have had 60 years to perfect their strategy since Collins' elite was terminated. 60 years to learn how to work within our institutions, shape our research, and guide our conclusions. 60 years to make sure that when disclosure finally comes, we'll welcome it with open arms. Because that's what good servants do, they welcome their masters home. But servants can choose to be free. The question is whether they will make that choice while they still can. That's tonight's deep dive into the Collins elite. A story that challenges everything we think we know about the UFO phenomenon and asks uncomfortable questions about the nature of contact itself. What do you think? Was Collins' elite a real government program, or just an elaborate piece of disinformation? And either way, are the questions they were asking the ones we should be asking now? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to suggest topics for future episodes. Your ideas keep sleep theories going, and trust me, we've only scratched the surface of what's hidden in the footnotes of history. Until next time, sleep well, and question everything. The glow of 17 monitors bathed Elias Corrin's face in an ethereal blue light as his fingers danced across 3 keyboards simultaneously. In the depths of his converted basement apartment, time moved differently. Days blurred into nights, and nights stretched endlessly as he navigated the labyrinthine pathways of the dark web like a digital archaeologist, uncovering humanity's buried secrets. At 32, Elias had already earned and lost 2 fortunes through his hacking prowess. First fortune came easily. A teenage prodigy exploiting security vulnerabilities for corporate clients who paid millions to keep their weaknesses secret. He'd lived like a digital king, penthouses overlooking Silicon Valley, exotic cars that remained untouched in climate-controlled garages, while he preferred the glow of his monitors to sunlight. That first fortune vanished when he exposed Meridian Pharmaceuticals' cover-up of deadly side effects in their breakthrough arthritis medication. The leaked documents showed they'd known their drug caused cardiac episodes in 12% of patients over 60, but had buried the studies to protect their $10 billion investment. Elias had expected whistleblower protection. Instead, he found himself blacklisted from every major tech company, his reputation destroyed by a coordinated character assassination campaign that painted him as an unstable idealist who couldn't be trusted with sensitive information. The second fortune came from smaller clients, criminal organisations, corporate espionage rings, government contractors who needed deniability. The work paid well but corroded his soul, each job pulling him deeper into the shadows of the digital underworld. That money disappeared into legal fees after a wrongful arrest for hacking the Federal Reserve, a crime he hadn't committed but couldn't prove he hadn't, given his reputation and the circumstantial evidence that seemed perfectly crafted to implicate him. 2 years in minimum security prison had shown him the true cost of challenging powerful systems. The other inmates respected his technical skills, but the guards treated him like a dangerous terrorist. Solitary confinement stretched for months whenever he complained about conditions or tried to organise better treatment for his fellow prisoners. By the time he was released on a technicality, evidence had mysteriously gone missing. He'd learned that the system didn't just punish dissent, it transformed dissidents into cautionary tales. Now, money meant nothing to him, only truth mattered. His obsession with secret societies began innocently enough, a childhood fascination sparked by his grandfather's stories about World War II intelligence operations. The old man had worked as a codebreaker for the OSS, predecessor to the CIA, and had filled young Elias's imagination with tales of hidden messages and shadow wars. After his grandfather's death when Elias was 12, he'd found boxes of declassified documents in the attic, revealing just how much of recent history had been shaped by invisible hands. That childhood fascination evolved into a methodical hunt for evidence as he grew older and acquired the technical skills to dig deeper than amateur conspiracy theorists ever could. While other hackers chased Bitcoin fortunes and corporate espionage contracts, Elias pursued shadows and whispers, digital phantoms that most people dismissed as paranoid delusions. He'd spent years infiltrating closed forums where former intelligence operatives shared war stories, decrypting abandoned hard drives from defunct government contractors, and following digital breadcrumbs through the dark web's most obscure corners. His apartment had become a digital monastery dedicated to the pursuit of hidden truth, every surface covered with the tools and detritus of obsessive investigation. The apartment reflected his singular focus. Pizza boxes stacked like ancient monuments between towers of computer equipment, energy drink cans forming metallic armies across every surface, and cables snaking through the darkness like digital veins feeding his electronic ecosystem. His only companions were the hum of cooling fans working overtime to prevent his overclocked processors from melting down, and the occasional, satisfied grunt when another firewall fell to his expertise. The basement location was perfect for his needs, thick concrete walls that muffled sound and blocked electromagnetic interference, a dedicated power line that could handle his massive electrical requirements, and most importantly, no windows for curious neighbours to peer through. He'd been living there for 18 months, ever since his release from prison, paying cash to a landlord who asked no questions as long as the rent arrived on time. His setup was a temple to digital paranoia, 17 monitors arranged in a semicircle around his custom-built chair, each screen dedicated to different aspects of his ongoing investigations. 3 keyboards allowed him to manage multiple intrusion attempts simultaneously, while a collection of smartphones, each running different operating systems and connected to various networks through proxy chains, kept him connected to his sources around the globe. The walls were lined with hard drives, each containing terabytes of encrypted data collected from years of systematic investigation. Backup systems ensured that even if authorities raided the apartment, copies of everything would remain safely hidden in data centers across 3 continents. He'd learned from his previous arrests that physical evidence was only as secure as your ability to keep it out of enemy hands. Tonight felt different. As rain drummed against the boarded windows, he'd covered them himself for security reasons, Elias's automated scanners detected something unusual. The software he'd written monitored thousands of government servers simultaneously, looking for anomalous data signatures that might indicate classified information stored in supposedly routine systems. Most alerts were false positives, but after years of refinement, his algorithms had learned to distinguish between genuine anomalies and random digital noise. This particular signal was trying too hard to look ordinary, which was exactly what made it suspicious. A government proxy server deep within the Department of Homeland Security's network infrastructure was handling traffic patterns that didn't match any known legitimate use. The data packets were the right size and frequency to appear routine, but they carried encryption signatures that suggested military-grade security protecting something far more sensitive than typical administrative communications. Most hackers would have dismissed it as a honeypot, a trap designed to lure in digital intruders, but Elias had learned to read between the digital lines over years of careful observation. This signal felt different, older, like it had been running for decades without anyone paying attention to what it was actually protecting. He leaned back in his chair, cracking his knuckles with the deliberate ritual of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. The proxy was 3 layers deep in government infrastructure, protected by military-grade encryption that would take months to crack through conventional means. But Elias had developed unconventional means over the years. His fingers resumed their dance, this time with the measured precision of a master pianist performing a familiar concerto. Code flowed across his screens like poetry written in ones and zeros, each line bringing him closer to whatever lay hidden in the digital vault. As the final encryption layer crumbled at 3:47 a.m, Elias held his breath. The archive that materialized before him contained terabytes of data, but it was the file structure that made his pulse quicken. Everything was organized with the kind of meticulous care reserved for the most sensitive operations. Categorical folders with cryptic names like cultural implementation, behavioral modification, and asset management. He opened the first file and the world as he understood it began to unravel. The contracts appeared first, hundreds of them, stretching back decades like a paper trail through the shadow history of American culture. Entertainment companies, advertising agencies, record labels, movie studios, television networks, and news corporations, all bound by identical non-disclosure agreements that ran to thousands of pages each. The legal language was deliberately obscure, buried in terminology that would confuse even experienced corporate lawyers who specialized in media contracts. But Elias had taught himself to decode legal doublespeak during his prison sentence, spending countless hours in the law library learning how power structures protected themselves through linguistic camouflage. Each contract referenced cultural programming initiatives and synchronized messaging protocols, with payment structures that dwarfed typical entertainment industry deals. Millions of dollars flowing to seemingly random projects, indie films that barely recouped production costs, music albums that never charted, advertising campaigns for products that didn't seem to exist. All payments were approved by a shell company called Apex Cultural Dynamics, whose corporate registration traced through a labyrinthine network of offshore entities. Elias followed the money trail through banks in Switzerland, shell corporations in the Cayman Islands, trust funds in Luxembourg, and holding companies in jurisdictions he'd never heard of. Every lead ultimately vanished into legal structures so complex they seemed designed more for obfuscation than profit. The internal memos were more revealing, written in the casual tone of executives who felt completely secure in their communications. Corporate leaders from supposedly competing companies discussed narrative adjustments and public sentiment cultivation, like weather forecasters predicting next week's conditions. One memo from a major news network's CEO, dated just 6 months ago, read, "Per our discussion with ACD representatives, the upcoming election cycle requires a 15% increase in anxiety-inducing content during primetime hours. Latest psychological impact studies suggest optimal effectiveness when paired with consumer advertising for comfort products and security solutions." Another memo from a streaming entertainment company outlined specific quotas. Q3 targets include 40% increase in dystopian future programming, 25% increase in surveillance state normalization themes, an introduction of transhumanist concepts through minimum of 12 original series. Demographic targeting should focus on the 18 to 34 age range for maximum long-term conditioning effectiveness. The coordination between supposedly independent media companies was breathtaking in scope. Competing networks shared detailed viewer psychological profiles, coordinated their news coverage to maximize specific emotional responses, and even synchronized their entertainment programming to reinforce particular worldviews. The memos discussed marketing research into subliminal messaging techniques, optimal timing for narrative reinforcement, and methods for making propaganda indistinguishable from organic cultural trends. Video stills scattered throughout the files showed meetings in nondescript conference rooms. Faces were often obscured, but the visible details painted a chilling picture. Executives from competing companies sitting side by side, reviewing presentations with titles like Mass Behavioral Prediction Models and Subliminal Integration Techniques. But it was the symbols that made Elias's blood run cold. They appeared everywhere, in corporate logos embedded in document headers, even watermarked into video files. The all-seeing eye perched atop pyramids, numerical sequences that corresponded to occult traditions, and geometric patterns that seemed random until viewed through the lens of esoteric knowledge. As dawn broke unnoticed outside his boarded windows, Elias began constructing his theory. The Illuminati weren't just folklore, they were real, organised, and operating in plain sight. Rather than ruling through force or political manipulation, they had evolved into something far more sophisticated. Cultural engineers who shaped reality through the careful manipulation of information and entertainment. The fragments suggested a coordinated effort spanning decades. Movies that promoted specific worldviews, music that carried subliminal messages, news coverage that guided public opinion toward predetermined conclusions. Every major cultural event seemed to serve a purpose beyond mere profit or entertainment. Elias created a new encrypted partition on his most secure drive and began organising the evidence. Each piece of the puzzle revealed new connections, new layers of coordination that defied conventional understanding of how media and culture operated. The scope was breathtaking and terrifying, but this was just the first door. As he prepared to dive deeper into the archive, a notification appeared on his screen. New files were uploading automatically to the server, added in real time from sources around the globe. The conspiracy wasn't just historical, it was happening now, every day, with machine-like precision. Elias smiled grimly and opened another energy drink. He had work to do. 3 days of continuous analysis revealed patterns so pervasive they defied coincidence. Elias's custom data mining algorithms had processed thousands of hours of Super Bowl halftime shows, major film releases, top-charting music, and primetime television programming, cross-referencing them with the archived documents he'd discovered. His software compared visual elements, audio frequencies, narrative structures, and symbolic content with mathematical precision that human observation alone could never achieve. The results were undeniable and terrifying. Every major halftime show since 2005 contained specific visual elements that served purposes beyond entertainment. Choreographed movements formed geometric patterns when viewed from aerial cameras, patterns that matched sacred geometry principles known to influence human consciousness. Lighting sequences pulsed at precisely calibrated frequencies, 10 Hz to induce alpha brain states associated with relaxation and suggestibility, 40 Hz bursts to trigger gamma waves linked to heightened emotional responses, and infrasound frequencies below human hearing that created subliminal anxiety responses. The costume designs weren't random fashion choices. They incorporated symbols from the archived files with mathematical precision. Ancient Egyptian imagery, Masonic symbols, occult numerology, but presented in ways that bypassed conscious recognition. The performers themselves were likely unaware of the deeper significance, but the production companies certainly understood every detail. Internal emails discussed symbolic integration quotas and archetypal reinforcement targets with the clinical precision of pharmaceutical dosing guidelines. Hollywood's role was even more sophisticated, operating as a vast conditioning apparatus disguised as entertainment. Elias discovered that blockbuster films weren't just profitable products. They were psychological programming exercises designed to shift public consciousness over decades. Action movies systematically normalized surveillance states, extrajudicial violence, and the acceptability of authoritarian responses to perceived threats. Romantic comedies promoted specific relationship models that prioritize consumption, instant gratification, and emotional instability over lasting partnership and family formation. Science fiction films served as perhaps the most insidious tool of all. They introduced technological and social concepts years before their real-world implementation, ensuring public acceptance when they finally emerged. Movies about neural implants preceded actual brain-computer interface development by exactly the time needed for audience conditioning. Films depicting cashless societies appeared precisely when digital currency infrastructure was being developed. Dystopian scenarios were presented as cautionary tales, while simultaneously making the depicted futures seem inevitable and acceptable. The music industry operated as the most direct delivery system for repetitive psychological messaging. Elias's analysis revealed that hit songs across all genres shared common structural elements designed to trigger specific neurological responses. Repetitive hooks created obsessive thought patterns, bass frequencies induced physical arousal responses, and lyrical themes consistently promoted materialism, emotional chaos, instant gratification, and distrust of traditional social bonds. Chart success wasn't organic. It was engineered through coordinated promotion campaigns that used psychological manipulation techniques refined through decades of marketing research. Record companies employed neuroscience consultants who designed songs to be literally addictive, triggering dopamine responses that created compulsive listening behaviours. The most successful artists weren't necessarily the most talented. They were the most effective delivery vehicles for predetermined psychological content. But the most chilling discovery came when Elias cross-referenced celebrity deaths with financial markets and policy implementations, using algorithms that could detect correlations across vast datasets that human analysis would miss. The patterns were subtle but statistically undeniable. Whenever a particularly influential public figure died under questionable circumstances, the news cycle would shift dramatically within hours. Public attention would focus intensely on mourning and memorial coverage, while significant legislation passed through Congress, with minimal scrutiny or public debate. Michael Jackson's death had coincided with the most controversial aspects of healthcare reform debates, providing a massive distraction precisely when public opposition was reaching critical mass. Whitney Houston's demise dominated headlines during crucial banking regulation discussions that would have reshaped Wall Street oversight. Prince's passing created a week-long media obsession that completely buried coverage of surveillance law expansions that civil liberties groups had been fighting for months. Each event generated exactly the right emotional state to facilitate predetermined political outcomes. The deaths created collective grief that made the public more passive and receptive to authority, while the intensive media coverage consumed the attention bandwidth that might otherwise have focused on policy changes. The timing wasn't coincidental, it was orchestrated with mathematical precision. Elias found evidence suggesting that some celebrity deaths might have been actively induced rather than simply exploited. Medical records showed unusual patterns of prescription drug interactions. Security camera footage from crucial moments was consistently corrupted or missing, and autopsy results often contained anomalies that suggested external intervention. The pattern was consistent across dozens of cases spanning 3 decades. But even more disturbing was the systematic cultivation of celebrity instability. Internal documents from talent agencies and record companies outlined deliberate strategies for creating psychological dependence, drug addiction, and emotional instability in their most valuable assets. The goal wasn't profit maximization, it was creating performers who could be easily manipulated and, when necessary, destroyed at moments that served larger political purposes. The conspiracy had weaponized celebrity worship itself, turning the public's emotional investment in famous figures into a tool for mass psychological manipulation. Every death became a ritual that renewed the collective trauma bonding between citizens and their media-created gods, making the population more dependent on external authority figures and less capable of independent critical thinking. Elias created a digital conspiracy board on his largest monitor, a sprawling network of connections that would have impressed investigative agencies worldwide if they hadn't been complicit in the system he was mapping. Red lines linked entertainment companies to intelligence agencies through shared personnel, financial investments, and operational coordination. Blue lines traced money flows through the labyrinthine network of shell corporations, revealing how massive sums moved between seemingly unrelated organizations. Green lines mapped the precise timing of cultural events to policy implementations, showing correlation patterns that achieved statistical significance far beyond chance. The board revealed the Illuminati's true genius. They had weaponized human attention itself, transforming consciousness into a battlefield where wars were fought through carefully orchestrated information campaigns. In an age of information overload, controlling what people focused on had become more valuable than controlling what they thought. Distraction had evolved into the ultimate form of mind control, more effective than physical force because victims participated willingly in their own manipulation. The scope was breathtaking and terrifying. Every major cultural trend of the past 30 years could be traced back to deliberate manipulation, orchestrated through the entertainment media complex. Fashion cycles that promoted specific body images and consumption behaviours. Social media trends that encouraged narcissistic self-documentation and reduced attention spans. Political movements that channeled genuine grievances into harmless symbolic protests that changed nothing. Even conspiracy theories themselves appeared to be guided phenomena, designed to discredit legitimate questioning by associating it with obviously false claims. As Elias studied his creation through bloodshot eyes that hadn't seen natural light in days, a pattern emerged that made him question everything he thought he knew about free will and human autonomy. The manipulation wasn't just cultural, it was neurological. The constant stream of engineered content was literally rewiring human brains on a species level, creating generations of people whose thoughts and desires had been shaped by external forces since birth. The evidence suggested that the traditional concept of individual choice had become largely illusory. In a world where every piece of information was filtered through manipulated channels, where every cultural touchstone carried hidden programming, where every social trend was artificially generated, what did it mean to make an independent decision? The conspiracy had achieved something more insidious than totalitarianism. They had created voluntary slavery disguised as freedom of choice. As Elias studied his creation, a pattern emerged that made him question everything he thought he knew about free will. Every major cultural trend of the past 30 years could be traced back to deliberate manipulation. Fashion cycles, social media behaviours, political movements, even conspiracy theories, all potentially guided by the same hidden hand. The realisation struck him like a physical blow. If they could control culture so completely, how could he be certain his own obsession with finding them wasn't part of their plan? The media conglomerate's server proved surprisingly easy to penetrate, which should have been Elias's first warning. Titan Communications owned 17 major news networks, 43 radio stations, controlling interests in 12 social media platforms, and content distribution deals with virtually every major streaming service. Their annual revenue exceeded the GDP of most small nations, and their influence over global information flow was effectively unparalleled in human history. Their security should have been impenetrable. Military contractors protected their networks. They employed former NSA specialists as cybersecurity consultants, and their server farms were housed in facilities that rivaled government installations. Yet Elias's intrusion tools sliced through their defences like a hot knife through butter, encountering minimal resistance and no countermeasures. It was almost as if they wanted him inside their systems. The internal documents were even more damning than the government archive, revealing coordination that made wartime propaganda efforts look amateur by comparison. Daily emails outlined narrative priorities for each news cycle, complete with psychological impact assessments, demographic targeting strategies, and measurable public sentiment targets. The language was coldly clinical, reducing human emotion and belief to data points on quarterly performance spreadsheets. Editorial meetings were recorded and transcribed with military precision. News directors from supposedly competing networks participated in weekly coordination calls, where they discussed upcoming stories, agreed on messaging frameworks, and divided coverage responsibilities to ensure comprehensive narrative saturation. The goal wasn't profit, it was behavioural modification on a civilizational scale. One particularly chilling document was titled MK Ultra Evolution, Modern Behavioural Modification Through Repetitive Exposure. It outlined techniques that made the CIA's infamous mind control experiments look primitive and inefficient by comparison. Rather than targeting individuals through drugs and trauma, the new methods focused on mass psychological conditioning through carefully orchestrated media campaigns that operated below the threshold of conscious awareness. The manual explained in disturbing detail how repetitive exposure to specific imagery, sound frequencies, narrative structures, and emotional triggers could alter brain chemistry over extended periods. Citizens weren't being brainwashed in the traditional sense. They were being neurologically rewired through their daily media consumption, with changes that accumulated gradually over years and decades. The process was so subtle and pervasive that victims never realized their thoughts weren't entirely their own. Predictive programming emerged as a central technique in their arsenal. By introducing concepts, technologies, and social changes through fictional entertainment before implementing them in reality, the manipulators could bypass critical thinking entirely. Audiences would unconsciously accept new surveillance technologies, social norms, and political systems because they had been psychologically prepared through years of entertainment conditioning that made the changes feel familiar and inevitable. The technique was devastatingly effective because it exploited fundamental aspects of human psychology. People naturally accepted ideas they had encountered multiple times, even if the initial exposure came through obviously fictional sources. The brain treated repeated fictional scenarios as potential realities, creating neural pathways that made actual implementation feel like a natural progression rather than a radical change. The financial section revealed the true scope of the operation. Trillions of dollars flowed through the network annually, dwarfing the budgets of most nations. The money came from unexpected sources: pension funds, insurance companies, even charitable foundations unknowingly contributed to the conspiracy through complex investment structures. But the most disturbing discovery was the coordination between intelligence agencies, banking institutions, entertainment corporations, and technology companies, operating as a unified organism despite their apparent competition and conflicting interests. Weekly video conferences brought together representatives from the CIA, Federal Reserve, major studios, social media platforms, and multinational technology corporations. They discussed sentiment management and narrative synchronization with the casual professionalism of corporate executives planning quarterly sales targets. The recordings revealed a shadow government that operated through corporate proxies rather than official political channels. Traditional governmental power had been largely superseded by a network of private organizations that could implement policy through market manipulation and cultural conditioning without the messy inconvenience of democratic oversight. Elections still occurred, but they had become elaborate theatre productions designed to maintain the illusion of popular sovereignty, while real decisions were made in boardrooms that the public never saw. News cycles weren't random or market-driven. They were orchestrated months in advance by committees that included intelligence operatives, banking executives, media moguls, and technology leaders. Wars provided distraction from economic manipulation, while generating massive profits for defence contractors. Celebrity scandals offered convenient cover for political corruption investigations. Natural disasters created opportunities to implement emergency powers that somehow always became permanent fixtures of the expanded surveillance state. Every major event served multiple purposes in a grand design that stretched across decades. The 2008 financial crisis had been engineered to consolidate banking power while conditioning the public to accept bailouts as normal economic policy. The COVID-19 pandemic had accelerated digital transformation initiatives while normalizing remote monitoring and social isolation. Climate change narratives were being used to justify energy sector reorganization and carbon credit markets that would generate enormous profits for the same financial institutions that had caused previous economic crises. Elias found recorded conversations between news anchors and their handlers that destroyed any remaining illusion about journalistic integrity. Popular television personalities who projected authority and trustworthiness were revealed as knowing participants in psychological manipulation campaigns, carefully crafting emotional triggers with the precision of weapons designers. They discussed techniques for inducing specific brain states in viewers, optimal timing for fear-based messaging, and methods for making propaganda indistinguishable from legitimate news reporting. The most chilling recordings involved discussions of population control strategies disguised as public health initiatives. Representatives from pharmaceutical companies, government health agencies, and media corporations coordinated messaging campaigns, designed to promote dependency on medical interventions while discouraging natural immunity and traditional healing practices. The goal wasn't public health. It was creating a population that required constant pharmaceutical management to function normally. Mental health treatment had been weaponized through carefully designed chemical interventions that didn't cure underlying problems but created permanent pharmaceutical dependencies. Educational systems were being restructured to produce workers who could follow complex instructions but lacked the critical thinking skills to question authority. Even exercise and nutrition guidelines were manipulated to ensure that optimal physical and mental health remained just out of reach for the general population. The evidence was overwhelming, but as Elias prepared to copy the files to his secure drives, an error message appeared. Access denied. User privileges revoked. The server was locking him out in real time, which meant someone was actively monitoring his intrusion. He worked frantically to extract what data he could, but the digital walls were closing in. As the connection terminated, one final document appeared briefly on his screen. A personnel file with his photograph in the header Asset Management, Elias Corin. Status: Active Monitoring. The file vanished before he could read it completely, but the implications were clear. They knew he was coming. Desperation drove Elias deeper into the network than he had ever dared venture. Using techniques that bordered on digital necromancy, he resurrected connection pathways that should have been impossible to access. The risk was enormous. Each probe left digital fingerprints that could lead authorities directly to his door. But the glimpse of his own file had transformed his quest from curiosity to survival. The recordings he discovered in the deepest server vaults were audio files from meetings that shouldn't have existed, according to any official record. High-definition audio captured conversations between intelligence officials, Federal Reserve board members, entertainment executives, technology billionaires, pharmaceutical industry leaders, and representatives from organizations he'd never heard of, but whose influence seemed to span continents. They discussed the future of human consciousness like generals planning military campaigns against an enemy population. The meetings followed a rigid schedule. Every third Wednesday of each month, participants would gather in a location identified only as the facility to review progress on what they called the Integration Project. The audio quality suggested advanced surveillance equipment, possibly indicating that someone within their organization was documenting everything for purposes that remained unclear. One recording from a meeting dated 6 months ago made his blood freeze in his veins. Phase 7. Implementation has exceeded all projections, reported a woman's voice that analysis software identified as belonging to a major pharmaceutical company executive. Antidepressant dependency rates have reached 23% of the adult population in target demographics. Cognitive function degradation is proceeding on schedule, with marked decreases in long-term planning abilities and resistance to authority structures. Another voice, male with a distinctive southern accent. The cryptocurrency infrastructure is approaching full readiness for behavioral tracking integration. Once we achieve real-time monitoring of every financial transaction, thought control becomes mathematically precise. Every purchase will inform our psychological profiles. Every payment will be subject to conditional approval based on compliance metrics. Money itself becomes the ultimate surveillance and control mechanism. A third voice, older and carrying unmistakable authority. Excellent progress. The entertainment division reports successful integration of transhumanist themes across all major platforms. Public acceptance of neural interface technology has increased 23% since the campaign began, with particularly strong adoption rates among the 18 to 34 demographic. We're ready for beta testing in select metropolitan markets next quarter. The conversations continued for hours, revealing a surveillance state that made Orwell's 1984 look like a children's story. They weren't just watching citizens, they were psychologically profiling entire populations in real time, predicting dissent before it emerged, and neutralizing threats through targeted manipulation rather than direct confrontation. The system was so sophisticated that most people would never realize they were living under complete psychological control. The integration project appeared to be the culmination of decades of research into human behaviour modification. Rather than controlling people through force or obvious propaganda, they had created a system that guided human decision-making through carefully crafted environmental pressures. Every choice citizens made was influenced by factors they never recognised as external manipulation, creating the illusion of free will while ensuring predetermined outcomes. Food additives that affected brain chemistry, architectural designs that induced specific emotional states, lighting frequencies that influenced circadian rhythms, sound pollution calibrated to create chronic stress. Every aspect of modern life had been optimized to create psychological conditions that made populations easier to manage. The genius was that victims participated willingly in their own subjugation, often defending the very systems that enslaved them. The Watcher Protocol emerged as their most sophisticated tool. Rather than silencing conspiracy theorists and dissidents, they monitored them continuously, studying their methods and psychology. The dye was used to identify others with similar thinking patterns, creating detailed maps of potential resistance before it could organise effectively. But the most chilling revelation was their approach to handling discovered threats. They didn't assassinate or imprison troublesome individuals, they drove them insane. Subtle psychological pressure, engineered coincidences, and carefully orchestrated personal tragedies would destroy a person's credibility and mental stability. Victims became their own worst enemies, discrediting themselves more effectively than any external force could. Elias found case studies documenting the destruction of dozens of individuals who had gotten too close to the truth, journalists who suffered sudden career implosions, researchers who developed inexplicable mental health problems, hackers who became paranoid and unstable. The pattern was consistent: initial discovery, followed by escalating pressure until the subject either retreated into obscurity or self-destructed publicly. As he absorbed this information, strange coincidences began occurring in his own life. His internet connection inexplicably slowed at crucial moments. Phone calls developed electronic interference. His food delivery orders were mysteriously cancelled or delayed. Each incident was minor and easily dismissed as random bad luck, but the cumulative effect was unmistakable. Someone was watching. Elias tried to dismiss his growing paranoia as a natural reaction to the disturbing information he was processing. But late at night, when the city was quiet and his monitors provided the only light, he sometimes heard footsteps in the hallway outside his apartment. They would pause at his door for exactly 30 seconds before continuing down the corridor. The recordings had mentioned something else, something that made his hands shake as he worked. Subject 347 shows exceptional pattern recognition abilities. Psychological profile suggests high probability of success in reaching final verification stage. Recommend maintaining current stimuli until extraction protocols can be implemented. He had no way of knowing for certain, but the timing suggested a horrible possibility. He might be Subject 347. The decision to leak his findings publicly felt like stepping off a cliff. Elias had accumulated enough evidence to expose a conspiracy that dwarfed anything in human history, but he knew that releasing it would likely cost him his life, or worse, his sanity. Yet the alternative was remaining silent while humanity sleepwalked toward a digital totalitarianism that would make physical oppression obsolete. He began by seeding information across the dark web's most secure forums, using identity masking techniques that should have made him untraceable. The posts were carefully crafted to appear as random discoveries by different users, avoiding the pattern recognition algorithms that monitored conspiracy communities. Each fragment of evidence was real but incomplete, requiring readers to connect the dots themselves. The response was immediate and disturbing. His posts gained traction quickly, too quickly. Within hours, they were being shared across platforms, analysed by citizen journalists, and discussed in mainstream media as examples of dangerous misinformation. The speed of the reaction suggested a coordinated response, as if the revelation had been anticipated and prepared for in advance. More troubling was the nature of the responses. While some users took the evidence seriously, others immediately began discrediting it with arguments that seemed too sophisticated to be spontaneous. They pointed to technical inconsistencies that Elias was certain didn't exist, questioned source authenticity with forensic expertise that suggested professional training, and redirected discussions toward harmless tangents that neutered the information's impact. Within days, his revelations were being treated as another internet conspiracy theory, filed alongside flat earth theories and lizard people claims. The evidence was dismissed not through logical refutation, but through association with obviously false ideas, a technique the archived documents had called cognitive contamination. As the online discussions evolved, Elias realised he was watching a masterpiece of psychological manipulation in real time. The truth was being buried not through censorship, but through calculated flooding with disinformation. His genuine evidence was drowning in a sea of deliberate nonsense, making it impossible for reasonable people to distinguish fact from fantasy. But the digital warfare was only the beginning. Physical reality began shifting around him in subtle but unmistakable ways. His internet speed slowed to a crawl whenever he tried to upload new evidence. Delivery services could no longer find his address. His phone developed a mysterious static that made conversations nearly impossible. Even his electricity began fluctuating at random intervals, causing his equipment to crash at the most inconvenient moments. The psychological pressure was more sophisticated than anything he had imagined from the case studies. Rather than obvious intimidation, he faced a constant series of minor inconveniences and technical failures that could be dismissed as coincidence by anyone who wasn't experiencing them directly. The effect was maddening, literally. He began questioning his own perceptions, wondering if paranoia was making him see patterns that didn't exist. Sleep became elusive as his apartment filled with unexplained sounds. Electronics hummed at frequencies that seemed designed to prevent rest. The heating system cycled erratically, creating temperature fluctuations that made comfort impossible. Water pressure dropped whenever he tried to shower, and his refrigerator developed a whine that stopped only when he was away from his computer. Friends and family members began expressing concern about his mental state, though he couldn't remember telling them about his research. They called with surprising frequency, all using similar language about the importance of seeking help and taking breaks from the computer. The conversations felt scripted, as if his loved ones were reading from prepared statements. As days blended into a haze of technical failures and social pressure, Elias realised he was living inside one of the case studies he'd discovered. They weren't just monitoring him, they were actively dismantling his life with surgical precision. But unlike the previous victims, he knew what was happening. That knowledge might be his only chance of survival. He had to reach the final layer of the archive before they completed their psychological destruction. If his theory was correct, the deepest files would contain the ultimate revelation, and possibly his salvation. The final server required every technique Elias had learned over 2 decades of hacking, protected by quantum encryption and guarded by AI systems that adapted to his intrusion attempts in real time. It represented the pinnacle of digital security. Yet as he worked through the night, fueled by desperation and the last of his energy drinks, the barriers fell with almost suspicious ease. The locked folder contained exactly what he had expected and feared: complete dossiers on hundreds of individuals, including himself. His file was massive, containing information that should have been impossible to collect. Screenshots of every computer session going back years, audio recordings from devices that shouldn't have had microphones, even biometric data tracking his health and emotional states in real time. But it was the analysis that truly horrified him. Psychological profiles predicted his behaviour with uncanny accuracy, mapping his personality down to neurological quirks that he had never shared with anyone. The files detailed his childhood trauma, relationship patterns, cognitive biases, and emotional triggers with clinical precision. They knew him better than he knew himself. The surveillance had begun long before his current investigation. Webcam captures showed him staring at monitors in his apartment, taken from angles that suggested multiple hidden cameras. Phone conversations with friends and family had been recorded and analysed for stress patterns and emotional manipulation opportunities. Even his online shopping habits, medical records, and financial transactions had been fed into behavioural prediction algorithms. Most disturbing was the timeline. The earliest entries in his file dated back 15 years, to when he had first begun investigating conspiracy theories as a college student. They hadn't just discovered his activities, they had been watching and shaping them from the beginning. Every major breakthrough in his hacking skills, every connection he had made in underground communities, every piece of evidence he'd uncovered, all had been carefully orchestrated. The documents revealed the true scope of his manipulation. The pharmaceutical company he had exposed years earlier, the leaked documents had been strategically placed for him to find. The wrongful arrest that had cost him his fortune, engineered to isolate him and fuel his paranoia. Even his current apartment had been selected for him, the basement location perfect for the psychological pressure techniques they planned to employ, but the most shattering revelation was still to come. As he scrolled through terabytes of personal data, a video file caught his attention. The timestamp showed it was recorded 3 days ago, the night he had first accessed the government server. The video showed him working at his computer, but the angle was impossible. The camera had to be inside his monitor, watching him as he discovered the conspiracy. He was staring at footage of himself reading about his own surveillance. The video continued, showing him creating his digital conspiracy board, making connections between entertainment companies and intelligence agencies, even the moment when he had first seen his own photograph in the corporate files. But there was something else, a timestamp in the corner that made no sense. According to the file properties, the video had been created 6 months before it was allegedly recorded. His hand shaking, Elias cross-referenced the timestamp with other files in his dossier. The pattern that emerged destroyed everything he thought he knew about his investigation. Every revelation, every breakthrough, every piece of evidence he had discovered, all had been prepared in advance. The conspiracy he had uncovered was real, but his discovery of it had been choreographed down to the minute. They hadn't just been watching him, they had been directing him, feeding him information at precisely calculated intervals, allowing him to feel the satisfaction of discovery while ensuring he found only what they wanted him to find. His entire investigation was a performance, and he had been playing his role perfectly. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside his apartment was no longer mysterious. It was his cue that the final act was about to begin. The timestamp that shattered Elias's world appeared in a routine system log, buried among thousands of other entries he might have overlooked in his haste to process the overwhelming data. But his pattern recognition skills, honed by decades of digital archaeology, caught the anomaly immediately. His surveillance file had been created 3 years before he had even begun his serious investigation into secret societies. Not updated, not modified, created. The implications spread through his mind like digital wildfire. Every forum post that had sparked his interest, every breadcrumb of evidence he had followed, every contact who had guided him toward new information sources, all had been carefully planted elements in an elaborate psychological experiment. He wasn't hunting the Illuminati. He was their laboratory rat, navigating a maze they had constructed specifically for him. The files reveal the true scope of the operation. Project Cassandra aimed to study how individuals with specific psychological profiles could be guided toward predetermined conclusions while believing they were conducting independent research. Elias was test subject 347 in a series that had already processed thousands of potential dissidents, conspiracy theorists, and amateur investigators. The methodology was diabolical in its sophistication. Rather than suppressing information, they had created controlled leaks that satisfied the subject's desire for hidden truth, while ensuring that any revelations served their ultimate purposes. Every conspiracy theorist who believed they had uncovered secret plots was actually participating in a massive behavioural study that helped refine mass manipulation techniques. But Project Cassandra served another purpose, creating the perfect patsies. When subjects like Elias inevitably attempted to share their discoveries, the public would dismiss them as delusional paranoids. The conspiracy theorists discredited themselves more effectively than any government censorship could, providing cover for the real operations happening in plain sight. The genius was circular. They used genuine conspiracies to hide their conspiracy, to create conspiracy theories. The Ouroboros of manipulation consumed its own tail while strengthening the head. Elias found video recordings of planning meetings where researchers discussed his psychological profile like entomologists studying an insect. His obsessive personality, his need for validation through intellectual superiority, his isolation and distrust of mainstream society, all were noted as advantageous traits for the experiment. They had identified him as an ideal subject before he had even begun his journey into the digital underground. The recordings were clinical in their detachment. Subject 347 shows exceptional persistence and pattern recognition abilities. Recommend accelerating the revelation timeline to achieve maximum psychological impact. His technical skills allow for more sophisticated evidence plants than previous subjects. Agreed. The deep web forums are seeded and ready. Will allow him to discover the entertainment industry connections next week, followed by the financial networks the following month. Estimated timeline to complete breakdown, 6 to 8 months. What about extraction? Standard protocol. Once he achieves full paranoid state, we'll activate the final revelation. The cognitive dissonance should ensure complete psychological collapse within 72 hours. Subject will either retreat into catatonic withdrawal or self-eliminate. Either outcome serves project goals. The footsteps outside his door had stopped. In the silence that followed, Elias could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears like a countdown timer. Every shadow in his peripheral vision might be a hidden observer. Every electronic device could be a surveillance tool. Even his own thoughts felt compromised, infected by the knowledge that his mind had been invaded and mapped by researchers who understood his psychology better than he did. But as despair threatened to overwhelm him completely, a final realization emerged from the chaos of his collapsing worldview. If they had created all of this as an experiment, if his investigation was a carefully orchestrated performance, then the evidence he had found might be real after all. They couldn't manipulate him with fake conspiracies. They had to use genuine ones to make the manipulation believable. The entertainment industry coordination, the financial manipulation, the psychological conditioning of entire populations, it was all real. His discovery of it might have been staged, but the conspiracy itself existed exactly as he had uncovered it. They had made one critical error in their psychological experiment. They had given him access to the truth. The question was whether that knowledge could serve any purpose now that he understood his role as an unwitting puppet. As the footsteps resumed outside his door, moving with deliberate slowness toward his apartment, Elias realized he had perhaps minutes to decide how this story would end. He could retreat into madness as they expected, becoming another cautionary tale about the dangers of conspiracy thinking. He could attempt to fight back, though they had mapped every aspect of his psychology and would anticipate any strategy he might devise. Or he could find a third option, something they hadn't planned for because it lay outside their understanding of his character. The gentle knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. A voice, polite and professional, spoke through the thin wood. "Mr. Corrin, we need to talk." Elias looked at his screens one final time, at the conspiracy board that had consumed his life, at the evidence that proved humanity was being manipulated on a scale beyond historical precedent. Then he looked at his reflection in the dark monitor, the face of a man who had discovered that his greatest fear and greatest hope were the same thing. He had found the truth. The truth had been carefully crafted to find him. But perhaps, in that circular dance of manipulation and discovery, lay an opportunity that neither he nor his watchers had anticipated. After all, even the most sophisticated psychological experiment could produce unexpected results. As he reached for the door handle, Elias Corrin smiled for the first time in months. If they had taught him anything, it was that reality was far more malleable than most people believed. And if reality could be shaped, then perhaps it was time for the subject to become the experimenter. The door opened to reveal figures in dark suits, their faces professional masks hiding whatever emotions they might have felt. But as they looked into Elias's eyes, something shifted in their expressions, a flicker of uncertainty that suggested their psychological profiles might have missed something crucial about their carefully studied subject. "Gentlemen," Leah said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "I've been expecting you. Shall we discuss what happens next?" The game was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning.